one thing he said in his inaugural address is worth listening to. And so I told the audience, whether he's your dear friend or not, he was correct. And he said, ultimately, it is the willingness of a parent to nurture a child that finally determines our national fate. You know, and he's right to recognize that important bond between parents and child, and the connection between family and the wider society and civil government. You know, he was on to something.
Welcome back to On the Line. In today's episode, we have the pleasure of sitting back down with Dr. Ryan MacPherson. And in this episode, he's going to do a deep dive into the educational movements that have taken place and some of the responses to help make the education that our kids go through thoroughly Christian. This is something that he is very well versed in. And in fact, he is the academic dean at Luther Classical College. So he's going to talk about some of his experience of what they're working on there and how that applies to the high school level, middle school, and even to the elementary level. Also, at the end of the episode, he talks about how to use the Socratic method, which is teaching via using questions. And he does it by using the Socratic method with me. So that's a very enjoyable time in the episode. We hope you enjoy. As always, if you can simply click the like button, that does a lot for getting this message out to new people. Or if you're listening on a podcast platform, simply leave a review and it does the same in that platform. Thank you. Enjoy the episode.
All right, and Bennett says we're live. Dr. Ryan MacPherson, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, how have you been? So we interviewed last August. Fantastic interview. A lot of people really received it well. We talked about parenting and stuff like that. It was great wisdom. We've applied some of it in our own household since then. So you've been probably not doing too much since last August, right? The last 8-9 months?
No, nothing at all, really.
No.
Just to college to start.
Just starting at college.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how's that process going? Luther Classical College.
It's moving along. So in January, we published the academic catalog, and just last week, we broke ground for our campus and a lot of other stuff happening in between. You know, brought on a librarian and other staff members too.
Yeah. New president?
New president. Started just about 8-9 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right.
It's exciting to see just I think how quickly the progress has happened. I mean, you could talk about like the logistics, like the groundbreaking and things like that. But I feel like the conversations, and the more I just hear it in so many different circles. You know, my dad reached out to me. This was probably 6 months ago or so, and he was at a pastor's conference. He's like, "Hey, these guys were talking about like you know about this, right?" And it's very much spreading. There's like a lot of excitement. It takes a lot of momentum to get people really excited about something, and it seems like this is something that's stretching across the country. That there's something going on here in Casper.
Yes, yeah. So we're in. I mean, who would think Casper, Wyoming, and why Casper? Who would think that? But we have. I think the number is now over 180 congregations nationwide in maybe about 34, 35 states, something like that. And then our prospective students over 190. Again, 34 states or so. And so right, it's not just a Casper thing. It's really a nationwide thing. But why Casper? People ask that too. And part of the reason is that we are at the center of 15 classical Lutheran schools, if you look on the map. And so in terms of preparing future classical teachers and having classrooms where they can practice, teach, and so forth, we actually are within a decent commuting distance of quite a number of schools that those students can choose from for their fieldwork experience.
So last year when we came out, so this was like when the last time we interviewed, the podcast wasn't even released yet. We were still 2 months away from kind of going public. So, you know, our church knew about it because we had conversations, and this is a church thing, Trinity. And so he said, "Oh yeah, I'm going out to Casper." And everyone's like, "We're going to Casper, Wyoming? Like, what are you doing out there?" But coming out here, not only like all of like that's, you know, fantastic, all those different things that are going on, both in the district and with some of the schools in the area, but this is a beautiful area. Like actually, I mean, we're here, right? We're up on Mount Casper. We're at, I think, 8,000 feet of elevation. This beautiful mountain. You've got are these pine trees?
Yes.
Okay, they're pine trees.
At least some of them are.
Yeah, I was not classically trained, so I'm not sure if they're pine trees. But yeah, it's very beautiful. It's a wonderful place. So I can see this being a good place where students would enjoy being here and being able to go on a hike in the morning. Just take, you know, an hour and a half, go do a nice hike, get a workout, get ready for their classes. So this is a very cool area.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. My children have enjoyed hiking, and actually, President John Hill of the district, he hikes several times a week when he can. Good exercise. I don't ski, but a number of people here are skiers too.
Are you just scared that you'll like break a leg?
Well,
That's my fear.
I have lower back issues. I've had surgery on my back. I think
Mhm.
I'm just done taking risks like that. So
Yeah.
I'll let other people ski.
The risks outweigh the benefits, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe let's start with this one. What would be like how would you describe the distinctiveness of Luther Classical College?
Sure. So we're Lutheran and we're classical,
Mhm.
as the name implies, and that's actually a pretty unique combination. So, an all Lutheran faculty teaching all Lutheran students and having them read the Bible and the Book of Concord in the first 2 years. So everything in the curriculum is really taught in that kind of conversation, where the Bible and the Lutheran confessions are the standards by which we evaluate everything.
Mhm.
So thoroughly Lutheran in all of those senses. And then also classical, which can mean a variety of different things. I mean, part of it is we go back to classical antiquity, the Greeks and the Romans, the foundations of Western civilization. But another emphasis that classical often includes is going back to primary sources,
Mm.
reading Plato and Aristotle or reading Gibbon on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, rather than reading, these knockoff textbooks that just kind of summarize little pieces, but going back to those sources themselves and engaging with some of the brightest minds of world history. So that sometimes is what people think of for classical. And then the other thing would be, especially in this day and age when there's so much of, what's your opinion and how does that make you feel? And let's include everyone in this discussion. That seems to be the big emphasis. Including people, yes, but
Mhm.
why? I mean, there should be a direction to that conversation. And so classical educators emphasize a pursuit of objectivity, pursuing truth, pursuing goodness, pursuing beauty, not just mixing lots of opinions and perspectives and comparing them and saying, oh, isn't that interesting?
Mm.
But saying, can we get beyond that to answers that are real, to answers that are actually helpful to people because they are people, because
Mhm.
they're created in God's image and there's a reality there.
Mhm. So does logic play a big role in that?
It does.
Mhm.
Yeah. Logic is one of the courses that we'll teach. And you should also know our curriculum is very, very integrated. That is to say, we're going to have a class called logic, but it's not like that's the only place where anyone ever thinks logically. We
Yeah.
hope that happens across the curriculum, and we have some intentionality there, some ways to ensure that theology is not just in the theology classes,
Mhm.
that history and philosophy and so forth are not just in the classes that might be named that,
Mhm.
but that it's part of, sometimes in classical education, they call it the great conversation.
Mm.
That let's read a handful of books together, let's talk about them together. And then we're able to bridge the gaps that are found today between those rather artificial distinctions of modern disciplines, a lot of which just goes back about 150 years.
Yeah. So how would you describe like the classical difference? I mean, you've already gestured towards this a little bit, but maybe you can kind of articulate it in maybe even in that historical way, right? But classical, what is the normal education system not doing that classical is doing, right? So if I go to the public school or to something that even if it's not public, but it's still that progressive type of, as you're talking about with the subjects, or we'll get to maybe history and social studies, and then I go on to the public college, even take out like the wokeism, right? Like let's not even,
right.
say the obvious things that are ridiculous. What is that missing that classical has?
Yeah. So even, go back 20, 30, 50 years, even before, these latest fads like wokeism or social and emotional learning and all of those kinds of things, you still find a tendency toward devaluing facts, rather than let's memorize some core facts that anchor us to reality and help us navigate the world. That's often looked down upon. And then there's this movement toward, and it can be called a variety of things, but critical thinking is one of the things it's often called. And so again, you want people to compare different perspectives and to analyze and to scrutinize and to evaluate. All those are actually really good things.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that you find them in like a kindergarten curriculum
Mm-hmm.
when people just aren't developmentally ready for that.
Mm-hmm.
And they also haven't learned a framework of basic facts, to anchor that discussion.
Mm.
And so to put it in its most simple form, I think classical education is common sense education. Let's start with the basics. Let's make sure we're grounded with some basic core truths. And then you build around that. And then as you get to the periphery, I mean, that's where things get really interesting. And that's where you do evaluate and you do compare and you do, have hypotheses and you do have differences of opinion and you do have to argue in that sense of a logical debate and try to, get somewhere. But if you start with a framework of some basic core knowledge and core facts, then you're able to do that. And if you also start by reading some of these great works that have been reread over the centuries, then you, as the expression goes, you stand on the shoulder of giants. You're not just reinventing the wheel, but you're able to learn from the best minds and then try to take that conversation further. And so in summary, I think it really starts with some humility that says there's a truth that's outside of my own personal opinion. And I want to try to learn it. And there are some other great people who've done a good job on that quest. So I can learn it from them and pick it up where they left off. And then I can kind of imitate their style, their approach to thinking through things. And then that's what makes me intelligent, is the ability to at first imitate what they're doing, but then later, make it my own. Just like when you're playing the piano or something, right? I mean, it's scales, arpeggios, cadences, they're basic building blocks, and you have to do these finger exercises. That's kind of like your factual framework. It might seem boring. It might seem stifling to your creativity, but it's actually freeing, because ultimately, once your circle of fifths and how to navigate in different key signatures, then you can actually start composing things that will sound good. And you can also sight read just about anything, because every good piece of music is made of those basic building blocks too. And the same, I think, is true across the disciplines. So classical takes you back to those fundamentals. And ultimately, this is why they call it liberal arts education, liberal in the sense of freeing, right? Ultimately, it frees you to be creative in a really productive and realistic way, rather than, let's just let people invent their own spelling and thank them for trying,
So it sounds like it really very much forms the individual, or teaches you how to think, maybe a little bit more than what to think. I think Dorothy Sayers, right, when she talks about it, she says the proof that our education system is failing. And when Dorothy Sayers, at like the 40s?
Yep.
Okay.
That's about right.
Yeah. So this is not like she didn't write this last month or anything like that. But she's saying the proof is that look at all this marketing around, and look how much the marketing, and marketing, they don't have TV back then, right? So these are, I don't know, like billboards or like newspaper ads. And she's like, look how well that works. That proves our education system is failing, because it means that people don't have the faculties to be free from being enslaved by the marketer. The marketer can convince you very quickly that you need to buy this thing that you don't really need. And the reason that you get taken in was because you don't have those free thinking skills. You don't have this proper logic to be like, is that something I really need? And then right? So is that kind of what you see as well?
Yes, I would agree with that. That whether it's consumerism in the market, or propaganda in the political arena, or for that matter, propaganda in education. Because you've always got the latest, greatest fad, the new textbooks, the new educational techniques, and then the whole education industry becomes this kind of self-perpetuating. They produce new people with master's degrees and Ph.D.s in these new subfields, so they can be the expert educators. But then it ends up with a life of its own that's detached from reality and the real deep needs that people actually have. And it just becomes kind of a perpetuation of a school system.
Yeah. So, maybe compare it back to, just like theology and in the church, right? It does seem like we fail sometimes at like the grammar stage, right? There's so many kids that I'll kind of witness where they don't understand even God's law, right? So they don't understand kind of those simple building blocks, but they'll have kind of these like final catchphrases. They'll be like, well, Jesus loves me, or whatever, Jesus will never judge me. It's like, well, no, that's wrong, but they have got these kind of tropes that they use, but they haven't like learned the grammar or the proper scriptures, but they've kind of just learned these takeaways. And I have experienced that. I told you, I had some more teaching experiences lately in some different settings, but I very much noticed where the people will have kind of these, well, I'll put it this way. There was one conversation I had where they kind of said I'm glad they did it. They were kind of saying, what about this with Christianity, right? And they were kind of sharing their doubts, the things they were wrestling with. And they would kind of lay one, and then we would get a little bit deep on it, but then they'd be like, but what about this? And they would lay something completely different. And it was like, there wasn't this ability to say, let's analyze this first claim and figure out whether it's true or false. But there was kind of this kind of shotgun idea of like all these different things that claims against Christianity, and maybe because there's all of these claims, maybe Christianity is wrong, without doing like the work of digging into that.
Right. Yeah. So, two directions here. One is, how do you teach people to have those discussions and ask the right kind of questions and sequence several questions so that you actually go somewhere with the conversation? And then the flip side of that is, once that process has taken place and you've arrived at some answers, how do you then capsulize those answers to teach them in a simple way to people who aren't ready to do that full exploration, right? So let me answer the second one first. And the answer there we find in Melanchthon's Loki. Loki meaning place or topic or commonplace or different translations of it. But it's sometimes considered the first textbook in systematic theology, which is kind of a big fancy word, systematic theology. He must be good because he was a systematic theologian, whatever that means, right? I mean, in its most basic sense, though, it means words like faith, grace, righteousness. You mentioned love. God loves me. Like, what do those words mean? And where do we find them in the scriptures? And how do we anchor them? How do we relate those words to each other? So even righteousness, Melanchthon and Luther have this distinction of two types of righteousness. The righteousness we have before God, which is a perfect righteousness whereby we're saved. And that's not from ourselves. That's the righteousness of Christ that we receive through faith. But then there can be that external righteousness that we're capable of to some degree among Christians as part of your sanctified life. But even among the heathen as what they sometimes called philosophical righteousness. So back to someone like Aristotle, who writes a textbook on ethics. This is actually in the Book of Concord. Melanchthon refers to Aristotle and says, as far as civic righteousness or philosophical righteousness goes, Aristotle's about as good as it gets. And he's got a great textbook. Nevertheless, no one can ever live up to God's standard. No Aristotle or anyone else, can ever achieve the perfection that God's law demands. But Christ has done that for us. And we receive that not by works, but through faith in Christ. And so even how that's unpacked, it comes down to defining a couple of key words so that you don't end up where we are today, where you see these billboards that say love is love. I mean, first of all, that's a tautology in terms of logic, because the subject love and the predicate love are actually the same word, which means you're not actually claiming anything new about the subject. You're just saying that the subject is the subject.
So it's not saying
love anything. Is love, green is green, table is table. Like you're not really getting anywhere new. You're not building with that. But what does it do? It's an emotional appeal, isn't it? Right. But what it really means is, well, if two people really love each other, shouldn't they be able to get married? Which is why we need my dear friend Socrates to ask some follow-up questions, Well, what is marriage? It is a relationship between two people. Well, is it any two people? Some people will say yes. So then can a 3-year-old marry an 83-year-old? Oh, well, okay, maybe not. So there are relevant distinctions among persons to determine which two persons actually can get married. Okay, so we've suggested that age is relevant. We've started with that. Is age the only relevant distinction? What about, whether one's male or female? Well, no, that doesn't matter. Well, why? Maybe it should matter. I mean, how do you know it doesn't matter? What is marriage for? Does it have anything to do with children? If it does, where do you think children came from? One man, one woman. So those kinds of questions get us beyond these love is love. And then you start to realize, oh, I never thought about it that way. Oh, well, maybe, that older view, that very old view of marriage, like pre-2015, that ancient view of marriage, right? Maybe there was something that was universal across cultures, right?
Back when people had clubs and they walked around on their bare feet.
Right. So that's, you kind of ask, well, what's a classical education? It's an education that can, on the one hand, boil it down to some simple facts that young people should memorize because it grounds them with reality. But on the other hand, it also teaches us to ask the right kinds of questions in order to make sure that those supposed facts really are facts. But the littlest children can't do that. That's why they need teachers and they need parents, But as we get older, especially by high school and college age, to be a functioning adult and to be immune to these propaganda assaults by the mass marketing team that you referred to earlier, that's where that kind of full maturity in the liberal arts really pays off.
That was a great example of a proper education being expressed in the way you just went through that, right? Because that's a question that so many people wrestle with, and I don't think they know how to go about it, right? Well, why would we say marriage? And just the way you went about it was all questions, right? Well, is it anything? Is it three? I mean, that was a great just kind of way of going through that, and that's kind of the goal. So maybe we can go about it this way. So how are you doing this at Luther Classical College? And we are for those kind of listeners. We're going to also tie this back into, if you don't have kids in college, or Luther Classical College doesn't affect your family right now because, that you don't have kids going off to college. We're also going to tie this into then how does that affect how you raise your kids in, elementary school, middle school, high school. But it might be cool just to start with, because you've been putting this together. This has been your job that you've been working on. So like, how are you structuring the curriculum here at the Luther Classical College, and why?
Right. So, yeah, first of all, just a context, like you said. So, Luther Classical College is opening in August of 2025.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what we're doing now, as you're interviewing me here in June of 2024, is we published the curriculum in the catalog. We're recruiting faculty. I'm working on refining the syllabi to basically expand the detail of what's in the academic catalog. Developing the curriculum, building a library. We have donations that have come in, more on their way. They're being cataloged as we speak. All of that is happening. And as you suggested, on the one hand, that's very important for the 60 or so students we expect to enroll for that opening class in August of 2025. But we have a bigger vision than that. And that includes that we're training our future students will be trained to be pastors, trained to be teachers in classical schools, trained to be homeschool dads and moms in classical Lutheran families, trained also to be parish musicians. And we also have a trade partnership track, we call it, and a general track. And so the trade partnership track is come for 2 years, get an AA, learn some great stuff with us, read great books, study theology, the classics together with us, but then go off and get a certificate in welding, diesel mechanics, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe start your own HVAC business or, work in a trade. But then we expect those are the people that are going to be on church council.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people who will be on the education board for your church or your school in the coming years too. And so we want them to have a solid education. Although our college will not directly train them for that trade, we want to train them for that other aspects of their fuller vocation as a husband, as a father, as a leader in their congregation.
How important is that? Because so let's say my son goes and he becomes an electrician.
Mm-hmm.
That's a certain portion of his life, but it's not by any means the most important part of his life. As you said, the most important things is he's going to be a husband, he's going to be a churchgoer, God willing, he becomes a father. And education is not just about, what are you going to do when you graduate to make money, but it is about how do we form someone to excel and be healthy in the areas that really matter in life. So LCC is able to do that. Even for someone that wants to go do the trades. Which is
exactly. Good. And so, you asked before, what's the difference between classical education and a lot of more recent trends? One of the recent trends is that education is for the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
You have all these great slogans. We need to prepare people for the what do they call it? The global workplace, or the global marketplace of the 21st century. You've got all these wonderful slogans like that, as if there was no global marketplace before, like as if the Roman Empire wasn't already multicultural and global and all of that other, as if we need some new tool.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, one of the first things to go is foreign languages. Like we want people to be culturally sensitive and be able to be part of the global economy, but don't learn another language. What? I've even seen, schools that promote study abroad opportunities and all of this, but then they're kind of downsizing their foreign language departments.
Mm-hmm.
Like, shouldn't those things go hand in hand?
Yeah.
I learned Spanish. I went and lived in Mexico, spoke nothing but Spanish for a while. That's the way it worked for me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand. I suppose you have your Google app that translates for you now, so maybe you don't need that. But the bigger problem isn't just the decline of foreign languages. But the bigger problem is this focus on your job, your career,
mm-hmm.
which is just a smaller part of your life. And so to take in a broader life. So yes, we want to send people to the seminary to become pastors, and we'll teach them Greek and Hebrew so that they're ready for that. But they need to be well-rounded. They need to be more than that. Partly to be a better pastor, to connect with their flock.
Mm-hmm.
Partly in case they don't become a pastor, then they can do other things. But partly just because it's good for all of us,
mm-hmm.
And so likewise with the trade school people. So actually 80% of our curriculum is common to everyone, no matter what you're doing. 80%, which is virtually unheard of. I don't know if there's another college that does that.
Mm-hmm.
You look into accreditation standards, and they say, make sure you have at least 120 credits to graduate, and make sure that at least so many of these are part of your gen ed core and things like that. And so we have to demonstrate that later on. 80% will be gen ed core, because those are the courses everyone takes in common. Those are the things everyone needs to know to function well, no matter what they do, and not just for their job, but for their service in their community and their family and everything else. So, back to this electrician that you asked about, I want him to read bedtime stories to his children. I don't want him to just be an electrician 80 hours a week and never see his family.
Mm-hmm.
So a literature class where you appreciate, language and literature and storytelling and all of that, and then you pick wonderful things to read to your children. That's part of what we're training our students for, as much as to go get a job and a paycheck.
Which I can attest to right now with 3 young kids. That's very valuable.
Daddy, read me a story, right?
Yeah.
They say it every night.
And I've spent so much time trying to just research and figure out, okay, well, what story should I be reading? And Little Pilgrim's Progress. Have you heard about that?
Yes.
So it's beautiful. So I gave this example before, but I just want to tell it to you because it was so cool. So there's the point where Faithful dies, is martyred, and we're like halfway through the story. My wife's sitting next to me and she's looking at me like, are you going to stop? Because like he's getting like beaten and like you can see where this is going. And I've got my 3 and 4.5 at the time, or that's their age now. And I'm like, I'm going to go through it. I'm going to kind of just trust the book a little bit. And it was just so cool to see them wrestle with it. But then like they had vocabulary now to think of death. And for a while they would bring it back up, but you could tell they were processing, but they were processing in a healthy way, because what happens to Faithful, angels come down, pick him up and bring him to the celestial city, which is the whole goal. Right. And now all of a sudden death has been put in this beautiful way. But that's just one example that I could give you a dozen from just that book alone of like what good literature does for young children. Right. And as a parent, you want to be equipped to do those things. And it's not even just finding like a Ryan MacPherson publishes the best books. Like that's helpful. And actually, can you do that, please? But being able to know how to engage these things, or how do I follow up on conversation? Because you know how to do the literature and you know understand what to look for.
And that's where, if you just study nothing but how to be an electrician, you don't know how to read books to your children. And also if you do nothing but get a present day major in English and go off and get your master's in English, most of what you do is postmodern literary criticism. It's philosophy that tears apart books, that analyzes them from some new perspective of our latest theorists, rather than trying to understand what the author was actually doing, or what the original readers got out of it, or what the timeless lessons are, like what you were doing, right? So you're dealing with questions of death. You're dealing with what happens after death. You're dealing with questions of God's grace and the promise of heaven, and how angels are there as escorts. And all of that can come out in your family conversations. And so ultimately you want your children to learn those things. And what a blessing that you were there to be the one to teach them, and to be the one later they'll come to with the follow-up questions. Because my experience has been that my children remember these things better than I do. You got so many other things on my mind throughout the day, that even when I sit down and read a story, and sometimes you find yourself at the end of the page and you're like, wait, what did I just read?
Yes, yeah.
But the kids are like, Daddy, turn the page. This is exciting. And so, you have those moments of parental exhaustion, but somehow the children have energy and they just soak it up, and they'll ask you about it later.
And they always know when you miss a page. Sometimes I'll accidentally grab 2 and immediately like, no, Daddy, you missed one. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Like they know the stories.
So we had this book that had several stories in it, and each story was exactly 16 pages long. And I didn't know that until one day my daughter said, you missed a page. Well, how do you know? Because I counted, and they're always supposed to be 16 pages long. So, we're basically outnumbered and outgunned in the whole parenting thing, which is why you need to go to college to prepare for it.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. All the different, the opening of the mind applies to just so many things, right? When you kind of look at it that way. So let me throw something. I want to hear what your thoughts are. So I was thinking about this as we were driving in on our long drive, and I was talking to Josh about this, and I was trying to think of what we're talking about right here, and I thought about it this way, because it seems like we're starting from all the conversations that I kind of engage in. We always start with like this end result that's like on some kind of job, right? So we want him to be able to make X amount of money. So we want him to be able to do computer programming, and we want him to be able to run his finances at home, which is a really good thing. Like, so then we say, so therefore, and then we kind of reverse that back and we say, 4th grade, let's get kids playing with computers, and they should use it in class so they understand. Or there's even arguments like we should let kids use AI, because that way they can be part of like the growth of AI and get good jobs. So I thought about it within the past, my own experience as a pastor. And sometimes I'll hear people that'll say like this about the education for what a pastor needs. And they'll say, well, pastor needs to be personable, which is true. Pastor needs to know how to give a sermon. The pastor needs to know how to do premarital counseling. They just think of, what do I see pastor doing? And then they say, well, why don't they just have a class on that? A class on how to do premarital counseling, a class on, how to do preaching, maybe a class on the Gospels or something like that. But the way the education worked at the seminary, and I'm very thankful for, is there's not many things I go back to and I go, what did I learn at seminary how to apply to this position? But what happened was we were systematically trained and historically trained, and we were just so drenched in theology that we began to think as theologians. And that takes time, and it takes it took what they did. It was really great. And it wasn't so much, let's spend hours and hours and hours making you preach so that you're a great orator. Although they do some of that. But it was more so, can you think as a theologian? And that gave me the skills to now navigate my job, because I know how to approach these things. I know how to watch out for heterodoxy or heresy, or, how to watch out for what people are, thinking theologically. And I've got the soft skills to go do the concrete things. But I think we forget the soft skills. There's probably a better word for that. Right. And then we look at education as a way of not forming the whole individual, but to your point, I just need to learn to be an electrician because that's what I'm going to do. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. You can say that's dumb, Brian, and I'm okay with that too.
No, I have thoughts on it. And so unless my thoughts are dumb, that's not dumb, Brian.
Okay, good.
I think what you're dealing with is this model. It's kind of a 20th century industrial model. I mean, it starts earlier, but it really hits education hard by the 20th century. And that is that, end product comes out of the factory, right? The high school graduate, the college graduate, the person who can go get a job and be productive in the capitalist economy and can be a democratic citizen and be good for, whatever, right? This is social engineering kind of model, right? And so in comes raw material, and 4 years later out comes high school diploma, another 4 years comes college diploma. So then the question is, what's the most efficient pathway? And you're right, you could apply it to the ministry too. You could say, well, a pastor needs skills X, Y, and Z, so we'll have a class on X, a class on Y, a class on Z, a post-test to make sure he's certified, and off he goes. We did our job and we did it efficiently, which is good stewardship, right?
Yeah.
So now you've got this Christian label on it that is good stewardship, and everyone has to be happy. So there's two problems with that. One is that we often aren't able to figure out the answers to these questions. What should be that end product? And secondly, even if we could, what's the most efficient way or the most effective way to get there? Right? It assumes that we can figure that out. And it assumes we can figure it out better than the guys last generation who did the other kind of school, right? Because we're going to revamp education to do this new thing. So that's assuming that even if a factory model is a good idea, right? The problem is, are we smart enough to run a factory? Are we smart enough to design the right kind of educational factory? But the other problem is the question of whether that's even the right way to think about education. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to have teaching across the discipline, even within classes that might be labeled as history or theology or philosophy or whatever. I'll give you an example. So we have a class that's going to be called The History of Ancient Greece. And one of the books will be to read Thucydides, who writes this history of the Peloponnesian War. So judging the book by the cover, it's military history, right? And indeed, there's a whole bunch of stuff with, battles on land and battles by sea and, who wins and who loses and all of that kind of stuff. But along the way, he includes a lot of speeches, including one of the more famous ones is the funeral oration of Pericles. So after a bunch of Athenians die, he gives this great speech about their courage, their valor, the importance of standing up for democratic Greece against, Sparta and whatever, that kind of thing. It's a great speech. That is to say that it's an effective speech. It's well written. It emphasizes things that engage the audience in a persuasive way. It was appropriate to the timing, the context, and so forth. So if you want to take a communication class to learn how to be a good speaker, or take a preaching class, homiletics, to learn how to be a good pastor, then it would be great to do that. And in fact, some books will just take that speech and stick it in an anthology of great speeches, and then you can go take a speech class. But imagine instead that you're reading this and you're getting, yes, the military history and some of the cultural history behind it and why there's a conflict first between the various Greeks and Persia, and then later the Greeks against themselves, each of them ironically taking turns trying to get Persia on their side against the other Greeks that they want to clobber. And I'm being a little anachronistic calling them all Greeks because they didn't necessarily call themselves that, more like Sparta versus Athens. But all of that's going on, but then there's speech after speech after speech. And then sometimes there's a debate where he has 2 or 3 speakers. And so what that does is it just opens up the mind to start to think, you picture you're there, right? So should the Athenians send an expedition to invade Sicily? They're fighting Sparta. Sicily's on the other side of Italy. But maybe if they go clobber them, it makes them even stronger. And then they don't have to worry about being clobbered by, Sicily later on. And so strategically, that makes a lot of sense, says a fellow by the name of Alcibiades. And then another guy by the name of Nicias says, no, that's a stupid idea. Let's just focus on Athens versus Sparta and get that job done first and not spread ourselves too thin. So they go back and forth. And maybe it's because of Thucydides, I found myself siding, and maybe it's just because I'm always risk averse, let's do the cautious plan, but I'm siding with Nicias, keep it pure and simple. Don't get engaged and spread too thin in some other, theater of war, right? But the votes go the other way. But then the irony is that Alcibiades gets recalled to Athens because he's under charges of treason and so forth. And so he was one of the generals who was going to lead this. Nicias didn't even want to go at all. They made him one of the generals. And now he's the main general who's still around because the other guy's recalled. So he has to fight it. And guess what? He was right. They lose. So then he's I know I have to surrender. There's that guy or that guy. To which of the two should I surrender? I think that guy's nicer. Let's surrender. He'll go easy on us. We're gonna move the troops over there and surrender to that guy. So he does that. And no, that guy's not nicer. So then they really get clobbered. So there's all these ironic twists. Right. And you almost get the sense of Thucydides can kind of see it coming, but he wishes he could stop it, but he just has to tell the story how it happened. Simultaneous to this, in Athens, you have the great tragedies of the day that have the same character, right? This sort of force of fate that's always sucking you toward that final act. And we all know it's going to end horribly, but we want to prevent it. So let's try this, let's try that. And everything you do either backfires at best or at worst, it actually accelerates the inevitable, right? And so there's this sense of, Greek tragedy that you also find in Greek history. So we have fiction and we have history simultaneous there in kind of 430 to 400 BC, roughly, is where we are in the timeline. And both with those same themes, but along the way, you've got great oratory and great speeches. And then you've got questions of ethics and character, both at the individual level. What makes a great general? What makes a responsible statesman? Why is Thucydides sad when Pericles, is no longer because the plague hits and he dies and so forth? Maybe we could have had a great leader a little longer. You kind of get that sense. What if? But then personal ethics is also part of social, political responsibility, right? So political science and ethics and history and literature and oratory and, theology too, just war theory. And this whole question of fate, is history just controlled by impersonal forces? Or is there a God, as Luther said, who is hiding behind masks, but guiding human affairs for his own good and gracious will? So what kind of class is that? Is that a history class? That's classical liberal arts is what that is. We'll probably just call it history, but it's more than that.
I mean, so much that stands out there, but one is that was I was fascinated by that. That was, and I've heard that, right? History, I was so bored of history in high school, college, not so much in middle school. I don't know how it was done, but I think it was done better back then. But history can be so boring. The textbooks is not what you just did, right? Because you're not reading the first source. You go and you open up, Roman history, and it's on this date, this guy was the emperor, and on this date, that guy was the emperor, and there's a debate on whether or not they this amount of people died in this war or it was this amount of people. Scholars are divided, and you kind of go through and you're I got to remember these dates. What are the names? And you go through that, and it's just it's brutal, right? It's unless your mind is programmed in a specific way. And I know some people who aren't programmed that way, right? That's just boring. But what you just did was engaging, right? You could see. You're teaching this at the college level, but I could see a seventh grader sitting at the edge of his seat in what you were just describing. And obviously there's versions of this that you would apply to the seventh grade level, right? But I've heard over and over from people who have had a background, which I was not classically trained up until seminary. And I think that's when my mind opened up. But those that were, they love history. We just had John D. Davidson on recently, and he has a history background from Hillsdale. And he ties that into the book he wrote, and he loves history, and he can get into those stories, and he tells it with gusto, and it's because he learned it in a certain way of what you just described. Because history it's not in the past; it's your story, and it's your story in the future tense too. And when you can kind of see that, it's beautiful.
Right. So part of it is great writers like Thucydides. So we're back to the factory model. If we could efficiently make you an electrician or a historian or anything else. Or we could reshape your way of thinking by exposing you to examples of excellence. So read people like Thucydides because he's the one who makes it exciting. It can't not be exciting once you've read. I mean, there are some boring pages, I'll be honest. It's a thick book, right? But once it's just like reading a novel. You got the same problem, or Jane Austen. It's like, first 5 pages, do you know where it's going yet? But then you get into it, right? So it's just like anything else. It takes a little patience. But really these great sources across the disciplines are the reason they've been read and reread by so many people for so many centuries is that they're exciting.
Yeah. I just had a question. Oh, well, let's do this now. Something I want to do, but
Sure.
History and social studies.
Yeah.
Can you kind of explain the difference there? Because what you're explaining is history from the classical perspective. In other words, the way that it's had been done up until just very recently, and places like Luther Classical College are recapturing that. But there's this thing in the middle, which is social studies. And is that good or bad?
Yeah, I think largely social studies is bad, or it ended badly. I think there could be some redeeming qualities among some of the intention there. But social studies, so let's paint it in the favorable light first, okay? So history as in names and events and turning points and things like that is incomplete unless we also have a sense of geography, a sense of political science, or what they used to call political philosophy, a sense of some of these other culture, arts, theology, these other disciplines, right? Because they all interconnect in the end. And so history gets myopic and shallow and too much just narrowed down to a timeline that's boring unless we include these other relevant things. So social studies would be history and economics and geography and politics and maybe a couple other things, but usually those are the main things, plus being the high school basketball coach. He's also the guy who usually taught these classes for whatever reason.
He was my football coach in high school,
I don't know how that happened. And I'm not sure which happened first. Like, oh, you teach geography, you could probably coach.
Yeah.
Or it's like, oh, you're a great coach. Well, maybe we'll have you teach history because no one else will. Or, that would be a dissertation in itself to figure out
interesting.
how that came about. But so the good side of it is that these other topics are relevant to complete the story. The bad side of it is you shove so much stuff in there. And then if it's a textbook, instead of going back and reading one of these classic works, that then it's just jumbled in there, compacted so tightly. And then someone adds a lot of color and then like a little link over it, like this is online. I remember like 20 years ago, that became the thing with all these textbooks have like in the sidebar, it's always, you can learn more online. There's an interactive video online, like as if that's supposed to somehow make up for the fact that the textbook is awful. Right? So that's, it's just like drinking out of a fire hose. It's just too much information, kind of disjointed, and it loses the narrative quality that you find in these great storytellers. And many of them will also, it's not like no one integrated geography with history until social studies was invented in 1942 or, some kind of story like that. You will find among the ancient Greco-Roman historians, like they'll pause and they'll say, in order to understand what's going on, I need to pause and explain geography. And then they'll go on for geography for like 3-4 pages. And then they'll come back to the action of who did what to whom next. And
hence the 300 Spartans. And there's this pass, right?
Right. Like then you understand, right? They paint the scene, which of course a good novelist would also do, kind of, we're here in Mount Casper, with these pine trees, as we discovered earlier. And so you paint the scene and then you can go from there. Right. So all of that had been done before. What happens is you jam it all into one book and then you try to align it with state standards. So it becomes, we need to check the box that said they learned about this and they learned about that and they learned about the other thing. So then you advertise, and we're back to marketing, right? You market to the schools and to the teachers. This book is aligned to state standards for social studies. One-stop shopping. Here it is, everyone. But it's not going to help people learn, So that's, and by the way, case in point, this morning, my wife goes over to one of the government schools down the hill. They're having this book giveaway, not even a sale. It's like all these books. Some of it is curricula still in the plastic wrap. We're talking boxes and boxes of Shakespeare's Hamlet. So we picked one up for Mount Hope Lutheran School. Nice. And we brought a copy home for the MacPherson homeschool. And then, mathematics curriculum, again, like with workbooks and all of these, things, multiple copies. Some of it's still shrink wrapped. I guess the school had too much of it. And maybe they moved to a different textbook for next year. And so now this is all obsolete. But like, why should math, yet last year's math is not good enough for this year's math? We're back to the marketing gimmick of textbook companies that want to sell textbooks. So they add their their interactive website links that you really don't need anyway, right? Instead of just using the same book. Euclid's geometry from 300 BC was used until about 1900 AD.
1980?
1980. Anno Domini. Yeah. In other words, about a century ago. I mean, classical people still use it today.
Yeah.
But it was used in like a typical high school in America or Great Britain as recently as the year 1900 was still basically be using Euclid. So that's like, 22 centuries.
That is interesting.
Of using the same book, essentially.
Yeah.
In translation, but really no major overhaul, just translation.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting because I was talking to someone recently and they were kind of they're like, well, there's these new studies that show like, this kind of new approach to reading helps with like reading comprehension in kids and da-da-da. So it's like this idea that, okay, well, now we've discovered something, which is the point. Luther Classical College is not claiming that there's some nuances that might be unique. You're not saying we've discovered the approach to education that no one's ever figured out. You're saying we got to go back to things that have been proven to work.
Right.
But
we're retro.
Yeah. And in this discussion, it was like we've just now figured out the new way. And I was thinking about that a couple of days later as I was prepping for a sermon. My mind got sidetracked on this. And I was thinking, I'm like, well, the test scores, they've got to keep recalibrating the ACT and SAT scores so that they can stay the same. Reading comprehension is nowhere near what it was. The ability for most seniors to read like something like Plato's Republic or anything even close to that. So like what in the last 100 years, I think when we talked with Christian Preuss, he said, what was the second? There was the Bible, and then the second most read book was
Pilgrim's Progress would probably be up there. That's one that you mentioned. Yeah. And Fox's Book of Martyrs in Britain and America anyway. Okay. That would be another very common kind of household book.
Yeah. So it was some of these, just Plutarch's Lives. And that was like those are commonplace for like middle of the road high school. So it's what makes what from that the trajectory of the last 100 years makes us think that we've done better on reading comprehension, the ability to wrestle with difficult texts.
Right.
Even I'm not a big SAT, ACT. I don't know what your thoughts are, but like. Even so, we keep going down on that. So why do we keep thinking that we are actually progressing in a good direction?
Right. Let me first explain what I think is not the cause of it. So, one way to tell the story, and it's a believable way for those who have not only survived social studies, but also socialist studies. So quick digression, right? The next step to throwing everything in your textbook and checking off state standards is then you realize you do need a narrative thread to hang it together. And then you borrow the narrative thread of Karl Marx, that it's all about the haves versus the have-nots, the rich versus the poor, the people with power versus those without. So then everything in history becomes usually, white Europeans kind of bashing everyone else. And that's the moral of the story, right? And we need to equalize everyone and elevate the minorities. So that's socialist studies, which is what most social studies has become today.
Thanks for saying that, yeah.
But the reason I wanted that digression is because if that's the way you've been trained through middle school and high school, then you are predisposed to accept the following claim. That the reason literacy levels are lower today is that we're including people of color or minorities or, whatever trendy label you want to use. And that they were always denied an education and only the white elites, which now Asians are like super elite among whites, right? I mean, the categories are always a bit weird and they're politicized. So please just take all these categories with a grain of salt. But that's the claim. And so the reason levels seem lower is because we're actually educating a broader segment of the population, and that's more fair and more equitable, and it's better for democracy, and it's the right thing to do. And I think that's actually false. I mean, I think it's good for anyone to learn literacy. I want to educate everyone. So that part's true. But the claim that somehow it used to be elite and that's why scores were higher, and now that it's kind of includes everyone, including minorities, that's why scores are lower. First of all, I think that's insulting to minorities. It's like a racial judgment. This is, sorry, your skin's not the same as mine. You'll never read as well as I will. And I don't believe that, and I don't want to teach that, and I don't want to promote that, and I don't tolerate that. And one piece of evidence I have for this, for many years, I taught a course on the civil rights movement. And so we have video footage, documentary video footage of things from the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. and we come back to Pericles and his great funeral oration and examples of great speeches, you find that African Americans with a high school education, and sometimes not even a full high school education, but very rarely with a college education. There were a handful of black colleges, and some of them did. And, Thurgood Marshall would be an example, a lawyer who argues Brown v. Board of Education later on. He's a Supreme Court justice, right? And so or Martin Luther King Jr., another one, goes off and gets a graduate degree. But many in the African American community, high school education and perhaps a little less than that is what they got. Well, that's misstating it. What did we just do? Do you see what happened? We equated schools with education, didn't we? High school, like they got a high school diploma, and that's as much education as they got. Oops, that's the wrong way to measure it. There are other ways to be educated. One way is to hear Holy Scripture read and preached in your Black Baptist or Methodist church your whole life, right? And so that was educational. And if it's the King James Bible, that's high literature. So these people actually were literate, and they were very expressive. They were very eloquent. And go back and watch, like, The Eyes on the Prize is one of the video series, an excellent series. It's like eight videos long or whatever it is. It's phenomenal. And it goes, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth. And you'll find these African Americans giving impromptu speeches before television cameras that no white college graduate in America could do today. Hardly. I'll add hardly, because there are a few. Right. And so to me, that's a big shame, right? That these African Americans that were begging and pleading to have a more equal education, and rightfully so, because they were being held down. But even as they were being held down, they achieved so much more than those who supposedly are the cream of the crop today. So something has changed, right? And I don't think it's that America has not been good to minorities, because that was a time when they were suffering more than minorities need to today anyway. I mean, this was pre-civil rights movement, wasn't it? And they achieved great things. So I gave a hint a minute ago of why people aren't going to church as often, or those who do go to church, what they're hearing is not going to be Scripture being read. Or even if it is, it might be like the Message or the Living Bible or some kind of simplified translation. And so we talked before about reading aloud to children. I think that's huge for literacy. Literacy isn't just about can you read, but can you anticipate what you're going to read? Because you've already listened to it and you understand language patterns and vocabulary. So you and I can read to our children at a higher level than they can read to themselves, because we know how to do the voice inflection and pronounce the words properly. So they get the gist of the sentence, even if there's a new word. By context, they'll infer what it means, and they'll understand the flow of the story, right? And over time, as they rehear that same word, now they learn the vocabulary. So then when they read for themselves, they need to go down a grade level or two. Because, unless they're going to look it all up in the dictionary, they don't know how to pronounce it or how to have the right sentence inflection. So the lack of parents reading to their children and the lack of hearing an old-fashioned translation of God's word, if you will. I think those two things.
Do you endorse King James for that reason?
Yes, but I mean also the New King James, and the ESV isn't far behind either. But the reason I hesitate is not that these and the thous; those are actually the easiest words. It means you, right? That's not so hard. Thy means your.
Yeah.
But there are some other archaic words that sometimes it's a word we still use today, but we use it in a different sense. An example would be the word prevent. If you know Latin, then literally it means come before. So today the word prevent means like interrupt and cause an obstacle, like to prevent someone, to block someone from doing something. It means like literally in front of, and vent, to come in front of someone to block their path is to prevent. But it used to also mean to like come into someone's presence in a more favorable sense. And so you'll be reading along, in the Psalms or something, and you might find the word prevent in the King James used in that older sense that isn't like a stumbling block or an obstacle, but it could just mean coming into someone's presence and joining with someone, right? So, but sentence structure wise, I think that the King James is good. The New King James has most of that. The ESV is one of the stronger ones for that reason. And so I would gravitate toward translations like that for the sake of literacy and also for the sake of fidelity to the languages of Scripture. But back to literacy then, and why, you said, well, people used to read Plutarch's Lives in high school and now they can't, right? So I think that they haven't heard enough things being read aloud to them that are quality literature in church or by their parents. And in fact, studies on literacy show that the most predictive factor is whether parents or a close relative, it could be your uncle, your grandpa, right?
Mm-hmm.
But whether someone at home reads to children regularly is the most predictive thing. It's not economic class, it's not like ethnicity or any of those other socialist study categories that we tend to divide people into and pit them against each other. Sometimes those divisions are real, and we need to identify those and solve those social problems when those kinds of divisions are real. But the trend with socialist studies is to kind of put everything in that box right away rather than looking at what's really going on. So encouraging great literature to be read in the home, and also having a solid Bible translation that's good English literature in the church that's read regularly, and hymns too. I mean, hymns are poetic, they're meaty. You know, the traditional Lutheran chorales, where they're very didactic, they teach doctrine, you know, they're very precise. A good hymn ought to distinguish orthodoxy from heterodoxy. You know, a good hymn is the sort of thing that an unbeliever would not feel comfortable singing. An excellent hymn is the sort of hymn that after singing it repeatedly, if you're not Lutheran, you'll become Lutheran, which is exactly what happened with some of Luther's early hymns. You know, like Out of the Depths I Cry to Thee. People were singing that while still under Roman Catholicism. And then the priests banned it. They forbade the people from singing it. But then Luther came to town a couple months later, and they were already Lutheran. Yeah. Because they had a Lutheran understanding of confession and absolution with no penance from the hymn.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. That's shame on me. I've never actually even thought about that, but I've never thought of the kind of the educational formation of the liturgy, the reading of the scripture. I mean, of course, I understand like the edifying, the spirit, the growth and kind of like knowledge, you know, but I've never thought about just like the formation of those words being exposed to kind of young kids, or even like the way you structure a sermon if you're doing it with some, you know, good rhetorical devices, or you're following a logical sequence, or you're answering questions, or you're kind of explaining things in the text, right? Like being exposed to that is a potent form of education, and I've never actually made that connection. So thanks for pointing that out.
So we're back to one of the key things of the classical method is to find excellent examples, and then those become models, and you expose people at an early age to those, and then later they learn to kind of mimic and copy it, perhaps arguably in kind of a thoughtless and slavish manner as they just go through the routine. But that process then becomes part of who they are, right? It molds them, it shapes them, as you were saying before. And then now that they have the fundamentals, now they have the freedom to go off and think their own thoughts and write their own speeches and write their own poetry and so forth. And even, you know, this idea of, well, we don't want rote repetition, and that's stifling their creativity if you make them just repeat and do it the same old way that the ancients did it. Don't we do that on the basketball court? I mean, don't we just say, go shoot 100 free throws? Right? You're just like working on your form for the free throw like 100 times. And we do that in music again with your scales and arpeggios. And that can be boring and it can be hard. And admittedly, that's about where I ended. You know, I was working my way around the circle of fifths and third year piano. And I knew at the time that like if I just stuck with it, I could get over that hump and play anything. And I never did. I got busy with other things, which is also okay. But now my children, I've got 3 children who are over that hump. And they can sight read just about anything halfway decently, right? And then play it through a couple more times. Now they're getting somewhere. And then they can do duets with each other and play for church and whatever. And they can, you know, they have the ability because they learn the fundamentals so well. And the same is true in the liturgy, that it gives us the fundamentals, both grammatically and structurally in terms of how the mind works. It communicates through God's gift of language. You know, it's using the best of language to do that. And then also theologically. You know, that we're a sinner, that we come before God in humility, that we confess our sins, knowing that he promised to receive that and to forgive us. And then he comes to us through the means of grace, and you kind of walk your way through the steps of the liturgy. It's all laid out with its own logic, right?
So it's almost as if the way that they kind of do all these like subjects that are just kind of all doing their own thing, you know, to some degree, of course, there's, you know, as they set up scope and sequence, you know, there's it's not like they're just blindly throwing things there. But that's not the way our lives are, right? As you were describing kind of the liturgy or even history, like your life is, you might be hearing someone's story and you might be discerning what's true and what's not true. And like you might have like a relationship with somebody and you might be trying to judge a morality, like make a moral decision. And like, It's like life is all of these different things kind of combining together in the way that you did with the history, or as you're talking about with kind of, and the scriptures are that way too, right? You're learning about history and you're learning about, a moral or a question on, God's judgment, or these bad things happening to Job, or all of these different things, right? And it all kind of molds together, but that's how real life is. So is it a way that like classical education reflects the way your real life is, and non-classical, where it's kind of hyper broken into subjects, is very foreign from the way that your actual life is?
Yes, that's my short answer.
Okay.
And ultimately, so where we're going to end at Luther Classical College is we'll have these capstone courses in, we call it integrated humanities, where senior year, imagine you're in class with maybe 20, 30 other people, right? And you're asked to read, let's say, 3 or 4 books. And so is the person next to you and the person next to him and so forth. And you might read a novel, you might read some political treatise, you might read some work of economics, you might read some art history book, whatever. It's going to be across the disciplines, so to speak, what you read, as well as what the fellow next to you reads. And then you'll make a 1-page handout. You'll do a 10 or 15-minute report on your book. And the same day you report, so will, let's say, 3 other people. And then there's a general conversation that follows, right? So at this point, you're a senior in college. You're becoming the expert. The professor has receded to the sidelines and is your coach to guide you. But by the end of the semester, you will have read, let's say, 3 or 4 books, and very different kinds of books. All of it for this last year is kind of 1800 to present. So the modern period, the postmodern period as well. So the idea is whatever you want to do, maybe you want to be a pastor. So you just want to do Greek and Hebrew and theology. Well, maybe one of your books is a work of theology, Bart's commentary on the Romans. Now you'll read it yourself and know how good it was or not, right? But what if your other work is Milton Friedman on economics? What if your other work is a Jane Austen novel? What if the guy next to you is reading a Dostoevsky novel? You didn't read it. You don't have time to read everything. But you got his 1-page handout. He talked for 10 or 15 minutes. And then you said, oh, wait, that reminds me of the other thing that I did read, or the thing that Sally said last week when we had our other discussion. What about? Are you sure? Or do you think these connect? Or what then? Or how does that fit with? And then you guys have that kind of conversation that presumably continues for the rest of your life, not formally giving speeches and writing essays, but you're always reading, you're always thinking, you're always talking to each other. And so that's where we want to end. And the modern university, it doesn't end there because they end with narrow specialists. Because your last 2 years, you just take classes in math and physics if you're an engineer. You just take classes in music theory and music history and music performance if you're a music major. The physicist and the poet have nothing to do with each other, right? They can't relate to each other. But we have a class called Physics and Metaphysics, in which we'll go through Einstein, his theory of relativity. We'll go through quantum theory, stuff like that. You can actually do it with a minimum of math. I know it's always scary, like quantum mechanics. Yeah. I never took calculus, Yeah. We can do just a hint of that kind of math, and you can actually get into the fundamental questions of those areas. It's not as hard as it sounds. And then once you're there, I think the key is not just to, reward all the people who love math and let them talk about it as mathematicians, but have the people who love math and the people who love poetry talk to each other and learn to love each other's favorite hobby, and also see the connection between the two. Because relativity theory and quantum mechanics, they raise fascinating questions about, like, what is this universe built of? Where did this universe come from? How long will this universe last? Can there be a God if this theory is true? What sort of God would that have? Are we starting to box God in if we say yes to this theory? Or could this be, in fact, the way that the one true God revealed to us in Scripture, in fact, works through this? But wait a minute, I thought Newton's theory of gravity was quite impressive. If you follow relativity theory fully, you realize Newton was wrong. Could Newton be wrong and Einstein right? Could both smart guys, I thought they both had to be right. Aren't they both really smart? What does that mean? So all of those questions come up and should be discussed, rather than let's just narrowly focus so we can build bridges and be civil engineers. We need civil engineers. I hope there will be civil engineers. Luther Classical College will not train civil engineers. What you could do is get an AA at LCC, transfer elsewhere and get an engineering degree, and then be a civil engineer, and then go to church faithfully, sing hymns in your home, and read bedtime stories. That would be a success story.
Yeah. You make me think. So one of my good friends was a mechanical engineer. He went to Purdue University, which is pretty high up on the engineering scale, and got a very good job after college with it. And he's just launching his own company now for something on the side. But the reason I bring that up was, that was his formal training. I lived with him for a year after college, and he's one of my best friends. So we talk all the time. We try to, anytime we can figure out a way to get together, we do so. But we're not normally talking about engineering normally, but it does come up. But it comes up in connection with like conversations about philosophy or theology or so things that he's reading in there. And so like we do naturally what you're talking about in probably a less prepared way, because we're kind of doing this after the fact. We're kind of, muddying through the waters as young people fresh out of college, me with a business and psychology degree and him with, but that's what you do, right?
Right.
We have beer, we would throw darts, and we would talk for hours. And that's what life really is, right? So doing what you're talking about that's what the enjoyment of life is thinking about the good and the true and the beautiful and wrestling with all of these different ideas, but having the ability to do that, right? To where you don't just get, you're not just blindsided by some interview on Joe Rogan where someone's like talking about the oneness of all things. And you're like, oh man, well, I guess that's what physics says. And that doesn't sound like, and then you don't know how to navigate that. But the people going through what you're talking about are trained to think through these things and talk through these things and be exposed to these different things, which they should be exposed to as free thinking individuals.
Yeah. So we've done a wonderful job of getting away from that factory model and wanting results and wanting an efficient pathway. We're just having fun exploring all knowledge and relating to each other as real human beings. But I want to actually go back to that factory model. So let's just assume that our goal is to find the most efficient pathway to help people be highly productive. Here's what's interesting. I think this classical liberal arts approach wins there too. The old joke is like, well, you're an English major, you'll never get a job except as a waitress, right? It turns out that a lot of these kind of liberal arts majors, or at least a minor in that area together with your engineering major, actually is a career booster. And so, for example, to major in philosophy, if you look at what the typical person who majors in philosophy gets paid, it's better than nursing. Or if you think computer science, growing area, you mentioned AI before, go into computer science, great career prospects, right? So Silicon Valley has actually been hiring philosophers to come and teach their software engineers in little philosophy clinics. And the idea is that philosophy stretches your mind. It helps you see new possibilities, and then it makes you pause and evaluate, say, well, wait, are we sure that that's on the right track? Or how does that, sorry about the microphone. How does that fit with this? All of those questions come up in philosophy. So you know the expression like to think outside the box, right? We need computer programmers who can think outside the box because that's where innovation comes from. That's where the competitive edge for this software company versus that software company will come from. And so the leaders in Silicon Valley have realized they don't want just people who did nothing but computer science their whole life. They need people who can also have this liberated sense of thinking that comes from the liberal arts. And they've literally hired philosophy PhDs to come and lead clinics that have no direct application. It's not like you go to this weekend clinic or whatever and you learn, Kant's philosophy and compare it to Descartes. And then they say, and here's how it will help you be a better programmer. No, they just leave it at that. But then Monday morning, they go back and they are better programmers because their mind has been stretched. And so they come at the programming question with, not a direct carryover, but just this idea of, well, it's what Yale College, when it was Yale College, not university, in the early 1800s, they called it the discipline and the furniture of the mind. And so they spoke of how subjects will discipline the mind, that is to say, stretch you and shape you and give you the ability to think in those categories. And then the furniture of the mind, like, now we need to furnish the house that we built. So we fill it with information, with facts. And so if you just learn your information of how to be a computer programmer, but don't learn any other kind of information, and if you never learn how to stretch and compare and recategorize things when they don't fit your initial expectations, then you might be good at just like the rote routine programming, but you're not going to be the innovator. You're not going to lead your company into the next great development.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break, and then I want to know some more of these classes, because you've described two classes and they both sound like they would be very interested, and I kind of wish I could take those classes, but we'll take a quick break.
Okay.
All right. And we're back, and we're talking maybe two more courses.
Okay.
to kind of help capture. And we were just talking about this, kind of at the beginning, the idea, and this is how these conversations always go, which is so beautiful, right? Because it's how real conversations go in life, right? You can't map these things out. So the idea was, okay, well, we need to focus a little bit on kind of K through 12 and on Luther Classical. And I think what we've done is we've just kind of bridged this gap, and everything we're talking about applies in both directions. So I think that's been really cool. So as you're hearing these last two courses, understand how this reflects too on what this would look like in a little bit of a different way, but it's going to rhyme with this at, if you went to a classical high school, or if you're in a classical middle school, elementary school as well. So maybe you mentioned, I've already forgotten the name of it. What was it? It was Foundations of Political Government?
Principles of Civil Government.
Principles of Civil Government.
Yes.
Okay. So if you want to tell us about that course.
Sure.
And you said you're working on this right now. So you're actually wrestling
right.
with how this should be expressed.
That's right. So this is an unrehearsed summary of what the syllabus might say in about 2 weeks. If I'm on time it's one of the next ones I'm working on. So my goal is to finish it up this month here. So this would be Law 100, we call it, Principles of Civil Government. And it's part of that 80% of courses that everyone takes in common. Regardless. And that's because, think Lutheranly, right? We speak of the three estates, the family, the church, and civil society. And we also speak of two kingdoms, church and the civil realm there too. So either way, slice it, dice it, two kingdoms, three estates, we need to understand civil society, civil government, that kind of thing. And we see this as a fourth commandment blessing, to honor your father and mother, and by extension to honor civil government as well. And in Romans 13, we have the marks of civil government, namely the protection of the innocent and the punishment of the evildoer. So theologically, that's our foundation. And then the question is to explore other great thinkers, including some of the smart pagans from Greece and Rome who had good ideas that might not be perfect ideas, but they are part of that great conversation. And so reading Plato's Republic, you alluded to that work earlier, reading Aristotle's work called Apologetics, and then working our way through the Middle Ages and up to the modern era. And so reading some Thomas Aquinas, reading
your friend Thomas,
my dear friend, you remember
Thomas Aquinas,
my dear friend Thomas Aquinas. Okay, a little side note: I gave a banquet speech at our Christian Culture Conference for Luther Classical College just last week.
I heard that was fantastic. Someone said you were hilarious,
and so one of the funny parts was I said, "My dear friend Barack Obama."
Yeah,
and the laughter, like I couldn't even continue. They just laughed for a while, but I actually had a serious point. So we'll digress because this actually comes back to civil government too. That God can bless us through my dear friend Barack Obama. One thing he said in his inaugural address is worth listening to, and so I told the audience, whether he's your dear friend or not, he was correct. And he said, ultimately, it is the willingness of a parent to nurture a child that finally determines our national fate. And he's right to recognize that important bond between parent and child, and the connection between family and the wider society and civil government. He was on to something. Unfortunately, he did not respect God's gift of life and the way that comes to be within the family. He did not respect God's gift of marriage, especially by his second term when he showed his true colors on that issue around the time of the Obergefell decision. But on that one sentence, he's right. And really, that's always our approach. When we read Plato, when we read Aristotle, they're not right about everything. But even when they're wrong, sometimes they are articulate and clever and intelligent, and they can get us thinking. And if they are wrong, then we ought to now take responsibility to figure out, okay, where did they go wrong and how would I fix it? What would it take to make it right? And when they're right, we should be thankful that God, through his gift of the conscience and right reason, these natural faculties under the first article, he gave me my mind and my senses and still takes care of them, right? As we confess in the creed. So we should expect that sometimes they got it right, or at least close enough to right to all work together and try to make it even more right, So part of that quest then in this class, Principles of Civil Government, will be to march through the ages, to read the great works and to glean from them insights and compare them. And if some of them are better than others, then we'll identify that along the way. And we'll try to figure out, well, what makes you think they're better, right? How do you know which is the better perspective? and ultimately to grasp toward what hopefully are timeless truths of what makes for good government. Not in a narrow-minded sense of, there has to be just, like you have to have the American Constitution and that's the only right way, or you have to have a monarchy like in much of European history. But I think we're back to, again, those two marks. We know from God's word that civil government exists to protect the innocent and to punish the evildoer. That's in Romans 13. It's in the parallel passage in Peter's epistle. So that's what government is for. And then the question is, which governments serve those ends the best? And sometimes, as Aristotle mentioned in his Politics, it depends on the kind of people that they're governing. That you've got your monarchy, your aristocracy, and your democracy, and government by one, by a few, or by the many. And depending upon the national character and history, one of those might be an easier fit than the other. But all three of them are vulnerable to tyranny in their own unique ways. And so that's, that opens up that whole discussion of, all right, where do we find ourselves in the society we're in, and how do we make the best of it? What advice would Aristotle give us today? We can ask those questions.
That's fascinating. So two things. One, and this is just true. Good luck finding another college that will say, we're going to tackle this subject or any other subject, and we're going to begin with what does God's word say clearly. You might think there's a lot of other colleges out there that do that, but there's not. So if that's something that you want, Luther Classical College, and I pray there's others, and I pray there's more, in the future, but that's unique. It shouldn't be unique, but it is unique. So that is extremely important. But then the second thing that stands out as you kind of explain that is I've heard a lot of people say this, and they're dead right, that the two-party system we have in the U.S. is a very unhealthy thing, because you fall into this type of tribal, either you're Republican or either you're Democrat, and you got to pick one, and then you have to be fully on board with everything that they say, like it or not. But the same would work in all sorts of areas, right? So it's whatever you're going to argue, but it could come with forms of government, right? So someone might say, God forbid, but socialism is the best, and they'll say, no, democracy is the best. And then all they do is they kind of argue, maybe even without knowing it, or let's just imagine they do know these systems very well. They'll say, here's why democracy is the best, or here's why socialism is the best. But what you're doing is you're saying, can you use your critical thinking skills to say, are there ways that democracy might have some weaknesses? Or are there ways that, and can you articulate that? And you're training the mind not to just fall into, so teacher, tell me which one's the best. That's the best. Okay, that's my team. And then the next time I get in a talk with my friends, I'm going to say, you're wrong. This is the best one. That's a closed mind where you've been taught what to think, but you don't know how to think through the process or why you're even saying that. So just built into that, once again, is just these great critical thinking skills that you can apply to so many different things, and you're applying it to something that's very important, one of the three estates.
Yeah, let me put both of your thoughts. You talked about commitment to biblical theology and as well as this critical thinking, and maybe for some people that seems opposite, right? That if we're gonna, well, in my speech the other day, I said we are narrowly Lutheran, we are narrowly classical, but we are narrow-mindedly nothing, because we take a broad view that encompasses, the golden age of Pericles and all these great works from the Western tradition. And in this particular class on civil government, beyond the West too, Confucius, for example, or Sun Tzu, The Art of War, to see what that says about political science and leadership as well. So there's a bit of a paradox that on the one hand, we're very much committed to biblical truth in a way that is narrow, but not narrow-minded, I would argue. But I could see that others would accuse us, But on the other hand, we have a very open dialogue, and I would argue a more open dialogue than what, 30 years ago they started calling political correctness. And now we've had a whole generation of that. We now have college professors who were students when political correctness first came along 30 years ago, right? So people who don't even remember anything different is how bad it is now. But you're right that Luther Classical College is at least rare, if not unique, in terms of what we expect of our faculty. And so we do want the faculty to be all Lutheran, and we do want them to subscribe to the Book of Concord, much like you would as a pastor, in your oath of ordination. Very similar language there. And so we actually have in our application materials that we've drafted, have you read the whole Book of Concord? Are you ready to subscribe to that publicly? If not, do you have a plan to get yourself ready for that? And I've been working with a lot of prospective faculty. We are soon, this fall, I expect we'll have a more official hiring process, but already, people have been reaching out to me. So I reached back, or someone suggested a name. So I just reached out and just said, hey, we're starting a new college. We'll be hiring 2 or 3 for the next year and the year after that. And again, each year thereafter, where do you see yourself on that trajectory? Do you want me to write down and call you in 3 years, or do you want me to stay in contact with you now? I've been having those kinds of conversations. And along the road there, we have prospective faculty that really gravitate toward this idea too. They don't see it as constraining. They see it as liberating.
Mm-hmm.
They would love to teach at a college that has a firm commitment to Holy Scripture and a firm consensus that the Lutheran confessions in the Book of Concord are the correct exposition
Mm-hmm.
of Holy Scripture. And in some cases, one guy said, yeah, I've got a Book of Concord right here on my desk.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a theologian. That's not his discipline at all. But I mean, that's the way he operates,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what we want. And then there's another who says, I've read this part, but not that part. But my pastor and I are working on this, and I'd be glad to, work with my pastor more. What would you suggest, right? So no one is scared away by that, or if they were, like they're not talking to me anyway.
Yeah.
But I've got lots of people in conversation with me that are very much looking forward to that.
Mm.
And I think in the end, the fact that we have a firm commitment on some of those, non-negotiable points that come from theology, that actually gives us an anchoring that lets us, drift without drifting too far when it comes to these other issues where the Bible doesn't give us a firm answer one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
You find a variety of government forms in the Bible descriptively. Paul's letter to the Romans prescriptively comes in a context in which you had a rather corrupt and centralized power,
Mm-hmm.
in Rome. And yet those basic principles still apply. So again, the title of the course is Principles of Civil Government, not just looking at, well, your political party is better than my political party or vice versa,
Mm-hmm.
but rather, how would we even start to evaluate what a good political party would look like? Going back to really the basic and most fundamental questions that way.
And asking the questions like you did with marriage earlier,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
Okay, so you've got an opinion on marriage.
Right.
You think that homosexual marriage is okay, and tell me what's your thought process. What were the questions you asked? Why did you ask those questions? Right. So it applies in all those areas.
Right.
Yeah.
And what we find is usually when we open up these discussions, we discover unfounded assumptions that, even the way we talk kind of church and state, as if there's 2 categories, one's church and one's state. And then, what do you do when you're studying the Constitution of Norway and you discover that one of the jobs of the king was to intervene between the church and the state? It's kind of weird as an American to think about, because I thought the king was part of the state, because I thought state meant government and the king's the head of the government, therefore king is in the government. But he's actually supposed to protect the state from encroaching upon the church. That's one of his jobs in the Constitution, or at least, it was 2 centuries ago.
Yeah.
And that's part of the rationale there for why he had to subscribe to the Augsburg Confession, because he's protecting specifically the Lutheran Church. So he needs to understand the church that he's protecting, so that he can understand what's threatening to that church, so that he can make sure that the state, by which they meant parliament and various, bureaucratic agencies, don't encroach upon the church. So that's just a different way of mapping things than we have in America. And so first of all, just recognizing that there are other ways to categorize and to map and to talk about these things. And then that again opens up the discussion of, well, which way is the best way? Or maybe it depends on historically where you are in your trajectory. Because if you have a group of people that are used to navigating a certain way, you can't just instantly, thrust some other system and expect it to stick. Either you either need to help them make the best of what they have, or find some kind of transition process. We saw this in Iraq, right? Over the last 20 years or so, with this idea of, we'll just come in there with a U.S. coalition force and we'll get rid of, regime change, right? And then we'll guide them through this process of establishing the kind of government that we would have if we were them. Well, that might not be what they're used to even figuring out how to do, so how stable will that be? Is that the best model for them? If the goal is to protect the innocent and punish the evildoer, there might be a different model. But then coming full circle, now that we've had a generation of socialist studies in our curriculum, how many Americans are even fit to continue with the same kind of government that is outlined in the U.S. Constitution? How many of them understand it? How many of them value it? Does it fit for us, or has it become kind of a foreign entity because our people have become so foreign in their way of thinking to what the founders initially gave them, you know?
Yeah. I had someone just recently ask me, Hamas, Israel, all that's going on. And they were like, so just like, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? That's what the answer they wanted. It's like, that's not how this works, right? It's complex.
It is.
And you don't have to take if that's, not everybody has to spend the time researching that. But if you want to be informed on that, you have to have the faculties to know how to go about doing that. And once again, a lot of people don't have those faculties. They don't even know how to begin to ask, and to analyze those things. So they'll latch on to an eloquent speaker, and maybe the eloquent speaker's right, and maybe he's not, but you end up you hope you get lucky and you find the right eloquent speaker to follow. But that's not the free mind, right? Yeah. So that sounds great. Let's do the last two, or, it's kind of one course, but I think you said it kind of manifests in two ways. This is one of the capstone. Is that right?
Right. So we have a senior thesis or senior capstone project for each of our tracks. And so remember, 80% of the classes are in common for everyone. But then if you are in the pre-seminary track or the teacher certification track or the parish music track or the general track, those would be the 4 BA tracks. There's also that trade partnership that we talked about, but that would be 2-year degree, an AA degree, and then you're off to trade school. So for these other tracks, we want them to do something big and special their senior year, right? And if they are, let's just say parish music is their track. So we have a lot of latitude, but it could include one or more of the following things. And this would be designed in consultation with a music professor. So the student might say, well, I'd like to write my own hymn, both as to lyrics and as to music, and then, direct a quartet that will sing it in 4-part harmony or something. And then I'll write a paper where I'll explain in terms of music theory and music history, why I wrote it in that style and what I'm trying to do with those chord progressions. And then I'll also talk about the theology of the lyrics in terms of which Sunday of the church year would it fit with a gospel reading and be a good chief hymn, before the sermon or something like that. And then I'll take live Q&A from the audience, right? So this would have a research component, a written paper that with footnotes, that goes through some of the theology and the church history and the music history and the music theory. It would have a composing component. It would have a performance component, and then, live presentation with live Q&A from the audience. Wouldn't that be fun?
That sounds awesome.
Wouldn't that be great?
I would do terrible at it personally, but that sounds.
But that's the next point. So now we have to reverse engineer this. If that's what you do in April or May of year 4, then what do we have you do in year 1 and year 2 and year 3? So you're there. So we'll make sure you've already gained some poise for public speaking. That's not going to be too bad. There can be opportunities to compose lyrics and music harmony, beforehand as well. So this isn't the first thing you've done. Opportunities both to sing or instrumental performance, solo or in ensembles, as well as conducting. And so we have a music skills class. That's hard to say quickly.
Yeah,
it takes skill to say music skills, doesn't it? That would include conducting. It would include composition and arrangement, and things like that. And the arrangement part, I'm not a music person myself, but we just brought in Dr. William Lipke, and he's our admissions director and professor of music once we have students to be a professor to them. But right now, full-time admissions. And he impressed upon me the importance of arrangement, by which he means you take a piece that exists and then you say, could we have it be performed by this instrument or that instrument? Or could we have it be sung in 2 parts or in 4 parts or whatever? And the idea is it may have initially been written to be performed by a certain group of musicians and vocalists. But if at our college we have a different talent set, and then moving forward, when you're at that congregation in that small town, and you're not a full-time minister of music with some grandiose title, but realistically, you're part-time choir director, organist, you're going to put together, a flex ensemble, and you've got, someone who plays the flute and someone who plays this, and you have something that was written for something else, but do you know how to rearrange it so that it works with the group that you have? And he impressed upon me that is key, because most of our students won't end up in some big place where you've got a wealth of musicians and you can just take any piece and there it goes. But we need people who can actively adapt good stuff by rearranging it, or compose new stuff to fit the strengths of the community where they're actually serving. And so that will be in the music theory class, in the music skills class, junior and senior year, leading up to a capstone music performance class, where it's realistic that a student with the right kind of coaching, and by then they'd be connected. They'd have their music professors, they probably some adjunct professors, church organists from the community and so forth, and they could know that they could go to these people and run ideas past them and make sure that it's a manageable project. And then it can actually be usable. It's not just some exercise to go through the motions, but out comes a piece of music that can be performed and can be used. So that's what we would do in church music. And not that every student has to do exactly that example, but it's that kind of thing. Yeah. Where you're saying, how can we take music theory, music practice? We're Lutheran. Let's have Lutheran theology shape it. Let's produce a gift for the church. Let's not just earn an A+, but let's actually benefit the people around us. So I envision projects like that being designed by our students in consultation with our faculty.
That's a great resource for the church.
Yeah. And then we have a teacher certification track, and this would be for future teachers at classical Lutheran schools. Our curriculum, both the 80% that everyone does in common as well as the 20% that they would do uniquely, includes aspects that are aligned to the benchmarks for the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education. So, which, by the way, was relatively easy to do. And I say that as a compliment to CCLE, because it means that they have good, usable standards. That, if, in other words, if you want to be a good classical Lutheran teacher, of course, you should be doing the things that CCLE has in its checklist. And of course, we should check those off and help students as we go along. And so ultimately, CCLE will evaluate our graduates independently. That's their job, not our job. But what we're doing is helping them build a portfolio of examples so that when they do submit that application, they can pull from this class and from that class. And it's just a very natural thing. They'll say, oh, yeah, we worked on that. Oh, yeah, we did that too. Oh, here it is, And then they're off. Usually they would apply after getting a job as a teacher for the first year. You get additional experience that you can also put in your portfolio. But we'll get them the lion's share of the way there is the idea. And then their capstone project could be a history project where you research something with the history of education, or it could be a pedagogy project where you're writing your own set of lesson plans on some topic, right? That maybe you say this is for grades 4 through 8, and it has to do with not socialist studies, but some other topic, right? And so it could be a philosophy of education treatise. It could be, there's a variety of ways you could go there, right? But again, it would be interdisciplinary. It would be Lutheran first. It would be classical second. It would be everything else third. And it would be the sort of thing that demonstrates that they're ready to go into the classroom and not just parrot from the teacher's manual, like some sort of robot that can follow the teacher's edition of the textbook. Yeah. But rather, they're ready to select texts that are good for the students they're serving. And they're ready to learn on the job as they recognize what's working and what's not for those students, so they can change their teaching technique and reach those students, or meet with the parents, or do whatever that needs to be done to really optimize the education. Yeah. And to keep people laser focused on Christ and his gifts to us through word and sacrament, so that we have that sense of we're Lutheran first, right? But then to draw from primary sources and to ask the big questions and to find Christian answers and, to lead their students on that adventure. So their project would in some way exhibit, not necessarily all of that, because that's rather impossible, right? Yeah. But they would have the freedom to carve out some space in that area. And it would basically say, I love classical Lutheran education and I'm ready to go do it. So that would be their project. For the pre-seminary students.
Real quick, if I can just ask a question. It's kind of an aside question, but I'm wondering, so you mentioned the CCLE. I don't even know if I know the proper way of phrasing this, but let's say a school, because there's a lot of schools that are transferring from not classical to classical, and they've got teachers that did not go to Luther Classical College. In fact, there's no teacher out there that has gone to Luther Classical College yet, right? Not yet. How difficult is it for, let's take like a 3rd grade teacher and an 8th grade teacher? How difficult is it for them to, as a teacher, to shift over to a different model like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So like what's the rehab plan, right?
Yeah.
So that depends how bad off they are already, okay? And so let me talk about kind of the bad off side, right? The pitfalls. The pitfalls would be that most programs in education, like if you major in education and get state certified to teach in the public school system, for the most part, the worst of them contain things that are just completely antithetical to God and his creation.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the promotion of sodomy, of transgenderism, the list goes on.
And the philosophies that undermine
and
that.
the philosophies that undermine them. And, 50 years ago, the problem was evolution, when that crept in. And the nice thing, right, about evolution is usually, at least in biology class, it was pretty obvious where it came in, or in geology or something. You see millions of years, you see this, change of evolution of the species or whatever, that kind of language. And then, of course, as you get into cell biology, it's like, so did the thing really evolve all this complexity in this design? Or, maybe, just maybe, it could have been designed, right? I mean, this is not rocket science here to infer creation. So yes, your textbook says it's evolution. But to navigate that, which I did when I went to a state university, you can have your guard up and you can do it. What's harder is when evolution ends up in social studies or in literature class. What's harder is when it's feminism across the curriculum and socialism and Marxism across the curriculum. And then the new thing actually is pedagogical requirements that coming out of like states like Minnesota, where teachers are required to foster a learning environment that is, safe and conducive for every so-called lifestyle, half of which are death styles, if we understand what we're actually talking about, right? And so rather than warn people of the dangers of these so-called lifestyles, we're supposed to affirm them. And that's the language actually in the Minnesota standards, is to actively affirm. And to be supportive. And there's just verb after verb after verb. That's very concrete thoughts and behaviors on the part of the teacher and the classmates alike in order to foster this so-called safe space. So it depends how far someone is, down those paths, that it can take a while. If you've sort of, as a Christian, kind of found a way to come to terms with it, it's through the blinding of your eyes and the hardening of your hearts. And I know no other way to say it. That's the nicest, most loving way to say it. It's a warning, and it's a warning that needs to be heard, But on the other hand, I know many people who have been teaching in public school system or teaching in a parochial school system that for the past generation or two hasn't been very classical. And there, I think the question is, how much do they kind of catch the classical bug, right? Have they been looking at Memoria Press, one of the leading publishers? Have they been going to a CCLE meeting and they're thinking, wow, I missed this. I love this. Where was this? Where was I? I'm so glad I'm here. And then you sit down and you have lunch with people and you say, well, what do you do for, your math curriculum and your science curriculum and so forth? And so I think the people who already are asking those questions are going to be well equipped. The challenge would be if you have an administration or a teaching staff where you have people who just don't see the value in it and they don't understand what's supposed to be worth it about that. They may kind of grumble and complain, and then they'll be stuck in their old ways. And then sometimes the worst is if you have people who are highly credentialed in the other system, because they have a master's, they have a Ph.D. in this world of education bureaucracy that has made all these claims and repeated these claims that all of those new models are good. And it's really hard to come back out of that. It's like coming out of Plato's cave, and the light blinds you at first. So what's the pathway forward for those who want to make the transition? The fact that they want to already is more than half the battle, I think. And then I would encourage them to look at resources like CCLE, presses like Memoria Press. There are Facebook groups for like Lutheran classical homeschoolers and things like that. And then reach out to some of the headmasters at some of these classically certified Lutheran schools and find out what they're doing. Go visit, go sit in on a class, do things like that. And then ultimately, one of our dreams for LCC also is to have regional conferences where teachers or, again, homeschool parents can get together for continuing education that the professors from our college can also offer.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, and let me add to it. Thankfully, there are at several of the Concordia colleges or Concordia universities, there are professors who are very much interested in cultivating classical Lutheran education, and also are working with CCLE as well. So our difference at Luther Classical College is that we're going to do exclusively that rather than be an institution that also has one foot in the state standards. But it's nice also to have colleagues at these other campuses that are really working on a closely related project. And we're grateful for that.
Yeah. Theology, last one. The capstones.
Yeah, so the pre-seminary capstone then. So here's where, remember everyone comes in learning Latin. And we intend to use Latin throughout the curriculum, both the first year, they read some Caesar and some Virgil and so forth, but then they read some Augustine and some Luther and Chemnitz and so on, some Reformation Latin in second year. And then after that, we have some elective Latin classes, but we still have Latin embedded in various parts of the curriculum. So that when you're reading the Book of Concord in a theology class, we could have the triglot and there could be a paragraph or two that we read in Latin when that's relevant and helpful. And so for the pre-seminary track, as well as for the general track, we'd like them to use Latin in some way. And then also for the pre-seminary track to use Greek or Hebrew or perhaps both. So it could be an exegetical study where you're looking at a section of, let's say, the New Testament, and you're looking at it in Greek and maybe comparing Jerome's Latin translation and Luther's German translation and talking about the theological emphasis that we find in those two translations and then compared to English translations and making some kind of recommendation or something like that. It may be more of something out of church history. There may be crossovers. I spoke of having these different tracks, but if we have someone who is pre-seminary, but they actually want to translate some Thomas Kingo hymns, from Danish into English that haven't been translated before, is that a theology project? Is that a music project? Is that a pre-seminary thing or a parish musician thing? Or I just think it's a good thing. Yeah. And so I think our answer is yes, please do it. If I don't care exactly which track you're in. So we will have some guidelines because we need to make sure you do something and that we show our accreditors that when you get something on your transcript, there's a good reason behind it. But we also don't want to box people in. Again, the whole point of a classical liberal arts education is to liberate people so now they're free to go off and do these great things and they have a foundation to stand on.
Can you take a minute to explain the importance of Latin?
Yes.
And at both, not just Luther Classical College, but especially here, just the importance of that in a, K-up curriculum.
Sure. So first, I'm going to go back to the factory model, which, again, we said is largely bad. But sometimes if you, grant the assumption of the person you're debating, you can show them that something they value actually in the end should support your conclusion, right? So it's a powerful rhetorical device. And so
once again, you've been trained rhetorically, so you know how to do that.
Well, this part's unrehearsed. So, we've been talking for an hour and a half or what. I don't know what's going to happen, but and they're not going to cut the camera because they told me that they just keep running it,
keeps going. So
we're
sleeping
we're
over
stuck
there. So
with
it's
this, right?
Yeah.
But if your goal is to, as efficiently as possible to get the best product of a graduate out, I still think Latin actually wins on that factory efficiency test. I really do. Because what Latin does is it helps you learn English grammar. How many people study nouns and verbs and adjectives? And then next year, it's like they forgot it over the summer, so they do it again. I remember we did it in 5th grade. We did it in 6th grade. We did it in 7th grade. And then they added the gerund, right? That was and then 11th grade, we're still learning the gerund. Because, you forget it in the summer and you don't need it in socialist studies class anyway, right? But in Latin, first of all, Latin is a fairly unique language because it's highly regular. They're just, you have these noun patterns and these verb patterns called declensions and conjugations, where you're adding these endings on the nouns and verbs, depending how they're used together in the sentence. But those endings basically are flags saying, hello, I'm the subject, or I'm going to be the indirect object today, And so they let you essentially diagram the sentence, if you remember sentence diagramming, which incidentally is logical. So we're back to discipline and furnish the mind. Make people diagram sentences. Make people know which ending goes on the Latin word when and why.
Real quick plug for Mr. Wakeman, who was my English teacher.
Sure.
So I've not, I didn't have classical education, but he, I don't think he would have ever even, I don't even know if he would have known what that term meant, but he drilled that into us to such a degree where I would say with full confidence that I learned degrees higher of English taking his class in middle school.
Sure.
So 6th or 8th I had him.
Yeah.
Than anything I learned in high school and anything I learned in college. Everything else was easier, lower than what I learned in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
And when I took Greek in first year of seminary, and I took it, well, like the summer before, 10-week course,
Right.
you know, I wish I had this and, you know, beforehand, we had to learn in like 3 days, you know, all this, like,
Right.
you know, the diagramming of sentences. And I would have been way over my head had I not been able to go back to what I learned in middle school. And that still stuck with me.
Right.
What I learned, and I had to polish it up, of course. But
Yeah.
the point being, the potency of just having even a little bit of that
Yes.
was monumental in my educational formation.
Right. Right. So let's put it this way: assuming your first language is English, if you also learn Latin, then I guarantee you will master English grammar.
Mm.
If you learn Latin and can work back and forth now between English and Latin,
Mm-hmm.
you've mastered English grammar.
Mm.
And if you have not learned Latin and English is your first language, you still might be able to master English grammar, but it's not guaranteed.
Mm.
Right. So back to factory efficiency model, we get people through Wheelock's Latin, the standard textbook. And by the way, this was actually produced post-World War II for the GIs who on the GI Bill are going to college, first generation college for many of them, right? So they're not coming from like these elite prep school kind of families, you know. And yet he made classical Latin accessible to sort of the common GI Joe, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was actually where that book came from, and it's still in print today. It's one of several that we recommend.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, we have a placement test that says, you know, did you finish Wheelock or the equivalent? Then you're ready to start with us. If not, here's some tools, and we'll help get you ready.
Mm-hmm.
For example, actually tomorrow we're launching our first online Latin tutorial for our prospective students, but I digress.
Yeah.
Okay. So if English is your first language and you get through Wheelock's Latin, then I guarantee you have mastered English grammar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then there's also a whole bunch of vocabulary in English. 60% of English words have Latin roots, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't done that, then you're trying to get by on 40% of your native language,
Mm-hmm.
which is obviously impoverished.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you think of what about the technical words, like the college level words, the graduate school level words, in theology, in medicine, in engineering, in all these other fields, it's Latin and also Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And so just by learning Latin, just like sheer efficiency, it makes a lot of sense to have people at least take 2 or 3 years of Latin in middle school or 2 years in high school or something, you know, just at least that much. Even if they don't finish Wheelock, they get halfway done.
Mm-hmm.
You still get, I'd say you get 2/3 of the benefits from getting halfway done, honestly, right? And so it's a huge payoff, okay? And then beyond that, you know, Luther credits Virgil with his Latin poetry and the meter in Latin, the way it reads in Latin, is just awakening his own ear to the idea of poetic meter, as well as imagery, and helping him as he wrote hymns, even in German, you know. And so again, you're kind of awakening the mind, you're exciting people to possibilities, you've given them good models that they initially mimic somewhat slavishly, but then they're free to go off and do things on their own. And you might think of like a jazz musician with a lot of improv.
Mm-hmm.
There are still rules to the improv, right? You have to stay in harmony.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't just play any note and expect it to work. You can choose one of the following 3 or 4 notes and it works,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you need to know enough to know which of the following 3 or 4 notes are the ones to choose and when. And it's the same in language, and giving a good speech and writing a good paper and writing great hymns, as Luther found. So Latin's good for that. And then you mentioned Greek and Hebrew. So imagine if you've already learned what the imperfect verb tense is and what the pluperfect is and all these fancy words, or the idea of active and passive and deponent verbs, which if those are fancy words and scaring our audience, they're actually pretty basic concepts. And we use them all the time in English without knowing. But once we give a name to it in both English and Latin, then when you sit down to learn Greek, then they say, oh yeah, this is a deponent verb.
Mm-hmm.
Been there, done that, right? Or this is the imperfect tense. Been there, done that, you know? And so it's going to make your next language go a lot easier. And especially Latin to Greek, where a lot of your endings for verbs and nouns, it's the same concept, and some of it spelling-wise, once you convert alphabets, it's not far. You know, the pattern is not that far off. And so it's a pretty easy shift. Hebrew is a whole different thing.
Yes, it is.
But perhaps that should teach us something, right? That Hebrew is a Semitic language, not an Indo-European kind of thing. And maybe there's a lesson, you know, to be learned in that whole thing culturally, right? Which, back to my factory efficiency model, if one of the big things is we're in a multicultural society in the global marketplace of the 21st century, and we need people to be ready for all of that, then don't you want them to learn a language other than their own? And Latin instantly opens up French and Spanish and Italian and all these others. So I'm still making that concession that we want an efficient factory in our school. And I'm saying, well, if that's really what you want, then you need Latin. So it's silly not to have it, I think.
And isn't it true that if you learn Latin and Greek and you have English, that you're about 70% of the way there of learning Spanish or French? I don't know if that's the exact number.
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but I mean, I do. I'm pretty proficient in Spanish. I did take a graduate reading class in French and had to read a few things in French when I was in graduate school, and it was a breeze. Pronouncing French aloud, that's a whole different thing. I would recommend getting Pimsleur, which I did use to help myself learn how to pronounce Danish before I went to Denmark a year ago. But that's all oral and just very good, repeat after the native speaker kind of thing. Excellent ear training. But in terms of the grammar, the vocabulary, Italian also, I've navigated a little bit of Dante, in Italian, because once you find out a couple of, like the verb to be and words like that, your demonstrative pronouns and your conjunctions and things like that, basically learn 50 words, like sort of those 50 really important words. And then even if you don't know how to pronounce it like a native, you can at least read the words on the page and navigate. And so it does open it pretty quickly.
So if I can kind of pull all this together, right? So, someone might say, language, but like, if anything, like, let's teach them Spanish, If you go, let's say, I don't know, maybe 3rd through 6th grade or something, Latin, you get 3 years of Latin. That kid goes off and becomes an engineer. You've kind of made a shortcut to help him with engineer because he's going to understand the terminology better. Certainly, if he's going to go into the science field, it's going to help him there. Certainly, if he goes into something like theology, it's going to help him there, right? So that's you've already accomplished that. So to your point, if you're trying to be efficient, rather than trying to learn these things later on, if you learn them early, it's going to help you with that later on. And then, if your goal is, well, we need him to speak a spoken language, you can do that for what we just talked about. But you're learning Latin, and then you go on to Spanish in high school. And now Spanish is that much easier. So you've actually, even by learning Latin, you've prepared yourself for learning Spanish. Correct. But then not only Spanish, but then maybe you want to go, I don't know if German falls into this or not, but like Italian or French, right? So you've done this groundwork that allows you to figure out later on if language is something that's going to be important to you and you want to speak languages or you want to move to a different country or something like that, or engage a culture around you that speaks in a different language and maybe even understand them better. Latin has kind of created shortcuts to all of these ways that it might manifest in your life later on.
Right. Exactly. And you mentioned the engineer who might want to go into theology. I was just slight revision there. I'd say we want every engineer to be a lay theologian. Really. I mean, that's really our goal at Luther Classical College, is that every man and woman coming out, at the very least, they're going to homeschool their own children. At the very least, they're going to do that, preschool, even if after that their children are ostensibly in some other building that has the word school on it. Parents are still the primary educators. They are, and no matter what, right? And so we want good theologians in the home, and we want them to know a good church when they find one, so that they'll take their family to a good pastor and a good congregation as well. And we want good people serving on church council and elders and deacons and whatever you call it at your parish. And so really, words like justification and sanctification, Latin root words, and on goes the list. And some of them we usually don't even translate, like ex opere operato or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So you get a few of those weird things in your theology class. It's going to be easier if you know Latin. If the goal is to have everyone learn Spanish so we can share the gospel with Hispanic population here in America as well as throughout Latin America, let's just assume now we want to approach this with a factory efficiency model to the work of the church. There too, I'm still going to say Latin is good. And I'm also going to remind you that I made a concession for sake of discussion to the factory model. We don't want that factory model coming into how we conceive of evangelism. Because when you do that, you end up with what's called the church growth movement, right? Which is to slim down and simplify in order to maximize the return on investment so you can save as many souls as possible, which at first sounds like a very pious thing, but it doesn't fit with our understanding of the means of grace, the office of the ministry, the vocation of us as individuals, as compared to, say, a pastor or an evangelist. All of those things matter. And I think in the end, we're going to find that singing good Lutheran hymns that have core substance is going to actually be more efficient and more effective and give you a higher spiritual return on investment. If you really want to force me to use those words,
Yeah.
it will actually do it better than the pithy praise songs that the church growth people would use. And likewise, if you want to prepare an evangelist, don't just teach them Spanish and send them to Latin America with their Bible, but teach them rhetoric, have them read the classics, teach them Latin. And yes, teach them Spanish too, but now they have the flexibility to adjust their communication style to the audience at hand, because they know from Cicero that it's important to give a speech on any topic to any audience at any occasion. That was one of these definitions of rhetoric from Cicero and Quintilian and these other great models of excellence that we want to borrow from. And then that will actually help your ministry more than just learning Spanish and going out as quickly as possible.
Let's do one more thing, and then we're kind of going to run into the back end of time, which we could go 5 hours, but we've got a 5-hour drive after this, and we want to beat the sun if possible.
And my wife wants me back, so I can't sit in the car with you for the 5 hours.
Yes, that was going to be the offer.
Okay.
We're going to Jackson.
Oh,
what do you think? Did I mark it well
if
enough?
my wife could come too, we could call her quick when we're done and see.
Yes.
Yeah. Take a break from the children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see what. So we talked earlier on, not here, but off camera, about the Socratic method, right? And if you can just maybe explain that and explain maybe a proper way to do it, right? Because I think what this is helpful for is this could help with teachers, this could help with pastors like myself. It's going to help with parents. So this is something that I think everyone can use in different ways, but it seems like it's a very effective type of teaching tool. Yeah. So if you want to kind of explain that and kind of explain, you've got a paper here, so I can.
Sure, I do. Let me try to teach Socratically what the Socratic method is. Let's just try this and see where it goes.
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
So you've heard of the Socratic method before. What would be a common definition that you've heard of before for Socratic method?
I would think of drawing a conclusion via questions.
Okay, so the Socratic method is where we teach by drawing conclusions via questions. Okay. And now let me ask you, do any kinds of questions work equally well, or is there one question might be a better sort of question than another for drawing conclusions?
Yeah, I would think maybe two things would have to play out. One would be, well, it depends on what you're teaching, but like you know that you want to bring them somewhere, right? Because you're the teacher, right? So you've got some kind of conclusion or something you want to accomplish. So the questions have to lead in a certain way that it can't be just so open-ended to where it's just like, well, tell me how you feel about this. So a question like that, like, tell me how you feel. Good. Now you tell me how you feel about that Bible, right? So that it's got to be directed in some way, but it also can't be too directed to where you're kind of forcing them without doing the critical thinking skills. That's all.
Okay. This is where my dear friend Socrates would say, that's wonderful. I asked you what sort of questions you think we should ask or not ask. Not only did you answer that, but you anticipated another important question is back to we're trying to draw conclusions, right? By asking questions. You also address what sort of conclusions. And it's not just any conclusion, but it's the instructor already knows we want the class to end here, right? We have a lesson to teach, right? And so you've really answered two things. If Socratic teaching is in its most simple and imprecise definition, drawing a conclusion by asking questions. Now, more precisely, we want to draw the kind of conclusion the teacher is aiming at for that day by means of asking questions that lead there but don't lead too directly there. So my dear friend Aristotle would say there's moderation, like how direct versus indirect is the question. We want the sweet spot in the middle because you don't want to spoon feed the answer. You're no longer asking questions, right? But at the same time, you don't want people to be off in left field all day long. Okay. So now another follow-up question, because that's part of it, is we keep asking questions, right? So you said that we want to draw a conclusion that is the teacher's goal for that day. Is any old goal from any old teacher equally good? Are there particular kinds of goals and hence particular kinds of teachers, presumably the ones who know what those goals are and how to get students there, that we really should be after?
Yeah. So good question. So we would probably start with, so if I could use maybe more of a concrete example, right? Because of course this would be done in a concrete example. We would say we've got a school, let's say, that has a certain goal about it. So if it's a Christian school, it wants to create Christian children. So therefore these conclusions should align with proper Christian doctrine. So yeah, that would be the short answer on that.
Okay, good. And what if we had a school that was focused on, we give the example of being an electrician. So what if you had a school of electrician training.
Yeah.
We would want the answers then to align with the National Electrical Code or whatever it's called, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So in a theology class, we want it to align with Holy Scripture. And in the electrician class, we want it to align with the electrician code.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other examples? What's another type of class or type of school that we might have?
So if we took kind of philosophy,
Okay.
right? So if that was like a formal one,
Sure.
then to some degree, the conclusion is what I want is that the person comes to an answer that makes logical sense throughout.
Okay.
So they don't have logical inconsistencies.
So we want logical coherence.
Mhm.
Okay. So a theology class, we want biblical truth.
Mhm.
An electrical class, we want the National Electrical Code
Mhm.
correspondence. And a philosophy class, we want logical coherence.
Mhm.
Do we also want logical coherence in theology, or is that unique to the philosophy class?
Yes.
You do want logical?
Yes.
Okay. So we expect things to be biblical and logical.
Mhm.
Now, are biblical and logical ever at odds, or are they always in harmony?
There are times where I don't think they're ever opposed, but there's a point where you have to go beyond the logical.
Okay. So some biblical terms are above and beyond logic.
Mhm.
Other biblical truths are at the same level and in harmony with logic.
Mhm.
And none are opposed to logic. They may appear so at first glance,
Right.
but they're either in harmony or just above and beyond.
Yes.
Like the mystery of the Trinity is.
Yes.
Right.
It's
Okay.
certainly above. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And then in philosophy, is it merely logical coherence? Is that the best philosophy can give us, or can they also give us correspondence to reality?
Yeah. How many angels can dance on the edge of a spear?
And maybe that's where they need help from theology or other fields or the electrician in order to go beyond merely logical consistency. Because otherwise you could be like in a fantasy world where, we invented a science fiction world and the novel is readable because it's all coherent, but it's not real, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just make-believe. But ideally philosophy would also get to the real, but it might need help from theology or electrical work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So what we've figured out then is Socratic question isn't just asking any kind of question, nor is it trying to get at any sort of conclusion, but rather there are conclusions that are appropriate to that discipline. And there are ways of asking questions that aim us in that direction. But we also don't want to aim too strongly there because then it's a giveaway. We're helping students to think for themselves. And in philosophy, we might not actually know the answer for sure. And even in theology, there are some of those questions where, we don't pin it down because Scripture doesn't pin down everything for us.
Adiaphora, another good Latin term.
There you go. Right. Yeah. Okay. So whether it's the teacher already knows the answer but wants to guide students there in a way that activates their own thinking, or whether the teacher and the students together are learning and trying to get as close as they can, those are two good reasons that the question shouldn't be too direct, right? And then you'll notice what I did with my questions. I asked questions about the previous questions, right? They were constantly circling back and clarifying. Yeah. And so this sometimes can be annoying, if you read Socrates and he's just seems to always be taking people astray. But I think Socrates at his best, and to some degree was Plato and later Aristotle that kind of put a shorter leash on this, ask questions like you were saying that they test out a truth, right? A general claim. And then at one point you went to an example, which was wonderful, right? And the first example, I think, was theology, and then we went to the electrical work, and then the philosophy. Now we have three examples, and now we can step back and we can generalize, and we can say, what do they all have in common, right? Because then we're really learning something. You're no longer learning just about theology or just about electrical work. You're learning about presumably any kind of education, those three things and others, right?
Yeah.
And so what we're discovering is that sometimes the teacher knows the answer. Sometimes even the teacher isn't quite sure, but at least knows generally the right direction. Always we want students to be moving that direction. But the whole point of not just telling them to copy down what I put on the board into your notebook is we want them to be engaging in that discussion and exploring it, at the very least because it activates their own mind. And also because some of those students may have insights that also teach the teacher, right? For some of those areas where there is room to still grow, right? So for all of those reasons and more, we should do Socratic questioning. Now, we've been silent on some things so far. We haven't talked about how many people should participate in the discussion. Like say you have a room of 20 students. Should we just go down the rows and go to each of the 20 and then go back to the first one again. So they have equal participation. Would that be the most efficient way, back to our factory model, of helping everyone stretch their mind and approach truth?
That's a good question. I'm thinking of, I would have 23 kids in the classroom when I was teaching senior apologetics and ethics.
Yeah.
And I don't think that would work very well.
Should we choose just the one best student and the professor and the student have a dialogue and everyone else listens in?
I don't think so.
Should we choose several students who tend to carry the conversation toward truth and toward goodness and toward beauty in a way that is constructive and helpful and other students can follow? Should the teacher be asking them a lot of questions and they even start asking each other questions to really carry the discussion? But then we also at times try to include every last other student at least once or twice along the way.
That sounds like a good route.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad you like it because that's what I do. And that's what I plan to do at Luther Classical College.
Yeah. That sounds good.
And I think depending upon which class you're in, it's also going to rotate who those students are because students will have strengths in music or geometry or theology or whatever, but everyone can grow and can learn together so long as we avoid the extremes of saying, well, we want to have everyone participate equally because we value everyone's viewpoint equally. That actually, it sounds fair and nice, but it doesn't value truth or goodness or beauty or objective standards or a real goal. And that's where it really falls short. Why pay tuition just to learn what your classmates think?
Yeah.
But pay tuition to work with your classmates and work with a professor and get towards some real answers in a collegial way with each other. Yeah.
I wish I would have had this conversation before I taught this last semester because we muddied through this. I think we talked a little bit before. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And, I think probably my chief one was I would fall into example 1 and 2. There'd be times where someone would really engage or 2 people would engage and then we would run with it. And there'd be times where I would try to bring in and you would get answers that would completely derail the conversation. And then it became, and if I was better skilled at this, I might have done a better job of reining it back in. But at some point you're like, this whole thing just kind of crumbled. I don't even know how to pick the pieces back up.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ryan MacPherson, thank you so much for this.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
This has been great. I think if there's one thing, maybe for someone that's watched through the whole thing, this has been enjoyable. I'm thinking if you're my professor, I've learned a lot, and doing this on a daily and weekly basis would be extremely formative for me. And it will be extremely formative for college kids that are able to do this. And I know that the faculty that you're choosing here are going to be, at least in the realm, right, of your skills and your ability to do this. And let me just say one last thing. When I was in New Hampshire, I was right by Thomas More College, which is a classical Catholic college out there. And this was before I had heard of classical education. I had some classmates at seminary they were kind of pushing it, and I was like, yeah, okay, maybe, not all that interested, wasn't really buying it. It wasn't taking the time to look into it by any means. I was like a lot of people's reaction, right? It's just kind of like, not all that interested. You guys sound like you're just kind of part of like this little group that gets excited about something. But then I started interacting with some of these kids.
Right.
And I even took I got to know one of the professors. We were reading Plato's Republic, and there were some kids that had gone through there, and it blew me away how articulate, how thoughtful, how logical they were. And they had far surpassed me, and they had just finished their 4 years of liberal arts, right, of a classical education. And that's when it shifted. And then some other things kind of fell down the road. That's completely converted me to this idea. But point being, if the sky is really the limit on what a child who's properly educated can do, both from keeping them in the church and having them not apostatize, and being drawn out by these broken and bad ideas, what you call it, the death style, yeah. So there's that aspect, which is an important role for you as a parent to protect your kids from. But even just of being thought leaders in various realms, like the sky really is the limit. And when you interact with people like yourself or students that have gone through similar things, and I'm excited to watch the students that go through Luther Classical College, you will see a difference. And I think once you see that, you can't unsee it. And that's kind of where I'm at, where I'm like, I've now seen this, I've tasted it. I didn't get to experience it as a student myself, really, and a little bit of taste at seminary. And that's just something that I so desperately want to pass on to not just my kids, but every child that I interact with, you know, as a pastor, it's like, I want you to have this beautiful gift. And I'm glad that you guys are doing this.
Right. We've talked a lot today about what happens in the classroom, but I think you're also alluding to lunch breaks and things like that. And so I'm so excited to be recruiting faculty who will sit down like this with students, and then also the students sitting down with each other, having these kinds of conversations spontaneously. And, you know, when I started a year ago, it was still a dream. We're at the point where it's becoming reality. There's that old expression, don't put the cart before the horse.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Luther Classical College has put the cart before the horse in a very positive sense. We've already gone through our first round of admissions for students who this coming fall, when we're not yet open, they would be in their first year of college if they went elsewhere. And we have 7 students who were admitted and paid a deposit to reserve their seat at Luther Classical College. They're taking a gap year to wait for us to open. And the response of everyone who was involved in the interview committees and reviewing their essays and their letters from their pastors and so forth, the whole application process, is that these students are just like what you were describing, right? Very high caliber, because they've had at least a taste of classical education through high school. And so they're at a higher level than most people are when they finish other colleges, honestly. Yes. Right. And they're just coming in. And then to envision them and the faculty interacting. And this past week at the Christian Culture Conference, we had current and prospective faculty present. We had an admissions event that had standing room only, even though I advertised it very late in the game. We just hired Dr. Lipke to be the admissions director. So he and I threw together this thing, you know, last minute kind of plan. I know how to run events, and I know we did a poor job of advertising. I just know we did. But what would have happened if we had done it right? We wouldn't have fit, because we had standing room only in this room, like 60 people come out to Casper for an admissions event. Like, who would have thought, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of it, there was a benefit concert that my wife coordinated, bringing in musicians from different states, as well as some local talent from our local congregations. And we had 4 generations up there performing. 4 generations represented, about 65 people total, doing different sections from Handel's Messiah, including prospective students, including prospective or current faculty, you know, in the case of Dr. Lipke. And so I said, cart before the horse. We've not even opened, but in a sense, we've already had a concert in which we've sampled the talent that we have in our incoming students. And it was just amazing. And then best of all, what were they performing? God's Word set to music, Handel's Messiah, Hallelujah chorus.
Yeah. That is beautiful. Yeah. Well, God bless all you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah. We hear it on the line. We support, we love it. And thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers.
God bless.